I've been walking these cemetery grounds for 17 years, and I can tell you that the dead don't usually leave footprints. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm the head groundskeeper at Riverside Memorial Cemetery. I know every headstone, every tree, every patch of ground that gets boggy after rain. I know which graves get the most visitors, and which ones haven't seen flowers in decades. I know the sound of my own footsteps on gravel at 5 in the morning, and I know the particular quiet that settles over the cemetery just before dawn. What I don't know is how to explain what's been happening in Section 12. It started 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning in late September. The night before had brought a steady drizzle, the kind that turns the cemetery paths into a patchwork of mud and fallen leaves. I was making my usual rounds, checking for storm damage and noting which areas needed extra attention when I saw them. Fresh footprints in the soft earth around grave marker J-108, leading away from the headstone in a straight line toward the old oak tree at the section's edge. The prints were small, maybe a size 7 women's shoe, with a distinctive tread pattern that pressed deep into the wet soil. They looked recent crisp edges, no sign of rain damage. I followed them about 20 yards before they simply stopped, as if whoever made them had just vanished into thin air. Eleanor Hartwell's headstone sat at the center of where the prints began. The marble was clean, recently polished by someone who cared enough to maintain it. Fresh white lilies lay against the base, their petals still closed tight against the morning dew. I checked my maintenance log and confirmed what I already knew. No one was scheduled for grave care in Section 12 that week. The flowers hadn't been there the day before. I should have mentioned it to the office, should have written it up in my daily report. Instead, I found myself kneeling next to Eleanor's grave, brushing loose soil away from the inscription. Beloved wife and mother, gone too soon. Born 1928, died 1973, 45 years old, the same age I am now. The next morning, the footprints were there again. Same size, same tread pattern, same mysterious endpoint at the oak tree. I called Janet in the cemetery office and asked her to pull Eleanor Hartwell's burial records. 20 minutes later, she called back with information that made my coffee go cold in my hands. Marcus, this is strange, Janet said, her voice tight with confusion. The burial log from 1973 specifically notes that Mrs. Hartwell was interred without shoes. The family requested it, something about a medical condition that made wearing shoes painful during her illness. I stared down at the fresh prints in the mud, each one a perfect impression of a woman's Oxford with a distinctive crosshatch sole pattern. Are you sure about that? I'm looking right at the funeral director's notes. Deceased wearing blue dress, pearl necklace, no shoes per family request. It's written in ink, Marcus. Original documentation. That afternoon, I installed a motion-activated trail camera near Eleanor's grave, the kind hunters use to track deer movement. I angled it to capture both the headstone and the area where the footprints appeared each morning. If someone was playing a prank, or if there was a logical explanation I was missing, the camera would catch it. The following morning brought the same impossible evidence. Fresh footprints, perfect in their detail, leading from Eleanor's grave to the oak tree. But when I checked the camera's memory card, I found 8 hours of completely empty footage. No movement, no figures, no disturbance of any kind. Just static shots of the gravesite under starlight and then dawn. I started arriving earlier, sometimes by 4:30 in the morning, hoping to catch whatever was happening in the act. The cemetery at that hour exists in a different world entirely. Fog clings to the ground like searching fingers, and every shadow seems to hold possibility. I would park my maintenance cart at the section entrance and walk the rows systematically, listening for any sound that didn't belong. During one of these early morning vigils, I realized something that should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. I was standing next to Eleanor Hartwell's grave, my thermos of coffee growing cold in my hands as I stared down at her headstone. I couldn't remember walking over to it. One moment I had been checking the irrigation system near Section 11, and the next I was here, as if drawn by some unconscious pull. It happened again 2 days later. I found myself standing at Eleanor's grave during my lunch break, a half-eaten sandwich forgotten in my hand. The strange thing wasn't just that I couldn't remember the walkover, it was how natural it felt to be there, like visiting an old friend. I started talking to her quietly about the weather and the changing seasons and how the cemetery looked different in autumn light. "I don't understand what you're trying to tell me," I said to the headstone one morning, kneeling to replace the wilted flowers with fresh ones I couldn't remember buying. "But I'm listening." The footprints continued to appear, and I continued to document them with photographs and measurements. Always the same size, always the same pattern, always ending at the oak tree. I researched the tree's history and discovered it had been planted in 1974, 1 year after Eleanor's death, as part of a memorial garden project. The donors were listed as the Hartwell family. By the third week, other groundskeepers started commenting on my behavior. Dale mentioned that I seemed distracted, that I was spending a lot of time in Section 12 when other areas needed attention. Rosa asked if everything was okay at home, if I was getting enough sleep. I assured them both that I was fine, but the truth was more complicated than that. I was sleeping, but my dreams had become vivid and recurring. In them, I walked through the cemetery at night, following a figure in a blue dress who stayed just far enough ahead that I could never quite catch up. She moved with purpose, as if she had somewhere important to be. And in the dream logic that makes perfect sense while you're sleeping, I knew I was supposed to follow her. Last Friday morning, I arrived at the cemetery before dawn and went straight to Section 12. The footprints were there, as they had been every morning for 3 weeks, but this time they were different. Instead of leading to the oak tree, they formed a careful circle around Eleanor's headstone, as if she had been walking in contemplation, thinking through something important. I set up my camera again, this time with fresh batteries and a larger memory card. I checked the angle twice and made sure the motion sensor was properly calibrated. If something was going to happen, I would capture it. But when I checked the footage the next morning, I found something that made my hands shake as I held the camera. 8 hours of empty cemetery, just as before, except for one detail I had missed during previous viewings. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, my own figure appeared at the edge of the frame. I watched myself walk slowly to Eleanor's grave, kneel beside the headstone, and appear to have a quiet conversation with someone I couldn't see. I stayed there for nearly an hour before walking back out of frame. I have no memory of leaving my house that night. I went to bed at 10:30, just like always, and woke up in my own bed at 5:15 when my alarm went off. But the footage doesn't lie, and neither do the fresh footprints I found that morning 2 sets this time, walking side by side. I still work, Section 12, still tend to the graves and maintain the grounds. But now when I find myself standing at Eleanor Hartwell's headstone during my lunch breaks, I don't question how I got there. I just listen to the quiet and wonder what she's trying to tell me, and why I'm the only one who can hear her walking. There are conversations that happen after midnight in funeral homes, and most of them shouldn't be possible. My name is Director Linda Chen, and I've been running Westside Memorial Services for 8 years now. It's a family business that my father started in 1987, and I know every creak, every settling sound, and every whisper of air conditioning that moves through these halls after hours. What I don't know is why Viewing Room B has been hosting discussions about people who are still breathing. The building itself is older than my tenure here, converted. Victorian house that was renovated in the early 2000s to accommodate our needs. The bones of the original structure remain. Hardwood floors that announce every footstep, tall windows that catch streetlight in strange patterns, and an intercom system installed decades ago that connects the viewing rooms to the main office. During business hours, it allows families privacy while keeping staff accessible for questions or needs. After hours, it should be silent. I work late most evenings, handling paperwork and making calls to suppliers, florists, and cemetery coordinators. The funeral business requires constant attention to detail, and I prefer the quiet hours when phones don't ring and bereaved families aren't asking questions I can't always answer. My routine is methodical. Lock the front entrance at 8 p.m., complete my administrative tasks, then walk through each room to ensure everything is secure before setting the alarm system. It was during one of these security walks, about 6 weeks ago, that I first heard voices coming from viewing room B, soft, indistinct conversation that seemed to drift under the door like smoke. I assumed someone had forgotten to turn off a radio, or that sound was carrying from the street, but when I unlocked the room and stepped inside, I found nothing but empty chairs arranged around a vacant casket stand. The voices stopped the moment I crossed the threshold. The next night, I heard them again. This time, I pressed my ear against the door and could make out fragments of what sounded like a consultation, someone discussing flower arrangements and service times in the measured, respectful tones we use with grieving families. I recognized the cadence, the careful pauses, the gentle questions about preferences and traditions. But when I checked our appointment calendar, no meetings were scheduled for that evening and no other staff members were in the building. I started documenting these incidents in a notebook I kept locked in my desk drawer. Tuesday night, voices in room B from approximately 10:45 to 11:15 p.m. Wednesday night, silence. Thursday night, conversation lasting nearly an hour, too muffled to understand specific words. Friday night, the intercom crackled to life. The intercom system consists of speakers and microphones installed in each viewing room, connected to a central panel in my office. During services, I can communicate with families without entering the room and disturbing their private moments. The system is old but functional, with individual switches that control each room's connection. All switches had been in the off position for months. That Friday night, as I worked through billing statements, static emerged from the speaker marked Room B. At first it sounded like electrical interference, the kind of white noise that old equipment sometimes generates, but gradually, voices became audible through the static fragments of conversation that made my hands stop moving across the keyboard. The service should be simple, nothing elaborate, a woman's voice said, crackling through decades-old wiring. She wouldn't have wanted a fuss. A man's voice responded, though his words were less clear, something about music selections and eulogy speakers. The conversation continued for 10 minutes, discussing details with the familiarity of people who had known each other for years. I sat frozen at my desk, staring at the intercom panel, where every switch remained in the off position, wondering if I should respond or simply listen. The voices faded back into static, then silence. I walked to viewing room B and found it empty, unchanged, with no evidence that anyone had been there. But on the guest registry that we keep on a small table near the entrance, someone had written a single name in careful handwriting, Margaret Winters. I knew Margaret Winters. She was 73 years old, lived alone in a retirement community 15 minutes from our facility, and had prearranged her funeral services with us 3 years earlier. According to her file, she was in good health and had simply wanted to spare her distant relatives the burden of making arrangements during their grief. What made the registry entry disturbing was not just that Margaret was very much alive, but that I had spoken with her that afternoon to confirm a small detail about her pre-need contract. The incidents escalated over the following weeks. The intercom would crackle to life at unpredictable hours, carrying conversations about funeral arrangements for people I recognized, longtime clients, community members, people who had walked past our building just days earlier. I started a second notebook, recording names I could discern from the static-filled discussions. Margaret Winters appeared repeatedly, but so did others. Robert Chen from the hardware store, Pastor Williams from the Lutheran Church, Mrs. Rodriguez, who brought us flowers from her garden. I called Margaret on a Wednesday morning, using concern about her pre-arrangements as an excuse for contact. She sounded cheerful and healthy, mentioning plans for a weekend visit from her nephew and excitement about a new book she was reading. I asked carefully about her health, and she laughed, saying she felt better than she had in years. 2 nights later, the intercom carried a detailed discussion about her memorial service, including specific hymns and a request for closed casket viewing. Last Tuesday night changed everything. I was working late, as usual, when the static began around 11:30 p.m. The voices were clearer than they had ever been, as if the speakers had somehow improved their reception. I heard a woman discussing arrangements with someone whose voice I couldn't quite place, going over details with the thoroughness I recognized from years of similar conversations. "The viewing should be private," the woman said, her words coming through with unusual clarity. "Just immediate family and close friends. Linda always preferred quiet gatherings." My own name, spoken through the intercom with the same careful respect we reserve for the deceased. I stood up from my desk so quickly that my chair rolled backward into the filing cabinet. The conversation continued, discussing flowers I would have chosen, music that reflected my personal taste, and service details that matched preferences I had never shared with anyone but had always held privately. She was devoted to this place. The unknown voice continued. It meant everything to her after her father passed. She never married, never had children, but she had this work. It was her calling. The accuracy was disturbing, not because the facts were wrong, but because they were entirely correct. These were thoughts I had never spoken aloud, feelings about my life and choices that I barely acknowledged to myself. The voice continued describing my hypothetical service with intimate knowledge of my character, my relationships, my private hopes and regrets. I walked toward viewing room B with unsteady steps, my hand trembling as I reached for the door handle. The conversation was still audible through the intercom, now discussing the timing of my service and which funeral home should handle the arrangements, since Westside memorial services would obviously need different management. When I opened the door, the room was empty except for two things that hadn't been there during my evening security check. Fresh flowers sat on the vacant casket, stand white lilies, and baby's breath, arranged exactly as I would have chosen for my own service. Next to them, the guest registry lay open to a page filled with signatures, names of people who were still alive but who had apparently come to pay their respects. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting I recognized as my own, someone had signed Linda Chen with yesterday's date. "I still work late most evenings, still make my security rounds, still lock up the building before going home, but now when I pass viewing room B, I don't stop to listen." The intercom crackles with static occasionally, and sometimes I hear fragments of conversations about arrangements I hope I'll never need to make. I've stopped keeping notebooks, stopped trying to understand what I'm hearing. Margaret Winters passed away last Friday. Natural causes, peaceful, at the retirement home where she had been happy. Her nephew called that afternoon to confirm the arrangements we had discussed so many times through the intercom static. Every detail matched exactly what I had heard those voices planning, down to the specific hymns and the closed casket viewing. The guest registry for Margaret's service filled quickly with signatures from people who had loved her. I recognized most of the names from those static-filled conversations, people who had somehow known to come and say goodbye. At the bottom of the page, someone had written my name in careful handwriting, though I don't remember signing it myself. Some graves refuse to stay filled, no matter how much earth you shovel into them. My name is Rosa Martinez, and I've been working cemetery maintenance at Highland Rest for 11 years. I know the weight of different soils, the way clay holds water and sand shifts with wind, and how long it takes for a fresh burial site to settle naturally. What I don't know is why Plot 47C keeps opening itself like a mouth that won't stay closed. The work here is steady and quiet, which suits me fine. I start at 6 a.m. when morning mist still clings to the headstones and the grounds are empty except for the occasional jogger on the perimeter path. My responsibilities include mowing, trimming, gravesite maintenance, and what we diplomatically call settling issues when the earth over a burial sinks due to decomposition or inadequate backfill. It happens sometimes, especially with older graves where the original work wasn't up to current standards. I drive a small utility truck loaded with tools, bags of topsoil, and a Honda motor that powers the equipment I need for most jobs. My route takes me through all sections of the cemetery in a systematic pattern that ensures every area gets attention at least twice per week. Section C, where the troublesome plot sits, is part of the older area established in the 1940s. The headstones there are smaller, more weathered, and the records sometimes incomplete due to a fire that damaged the cemetery office in 1978. Plot 47C first came to my attention in early March, when I noticed a rectangular depression in the ground, exactly the size and shape of a grave. The earth had sunk about 18 inches, creating clean, straight edges that looked almost deliberately carved. I checked my maintenance log and found no recent burial activity in that section. But settling can happen years after interment, especially with changes in groundwater or soil composition. I filled it with 3 loads of topsoil, tamped it down properly, and seeded it with grass mix designed for cemetery use. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. The work took most of the morning, and I remember being satisfied with how level and neat the repair looked when I finished. 2 weeks later, Plot 47C had sunk again. Same rectangular depression, same clean edges, same 18-inch depth. I consulted with Jerry, the head groundskeeper, who suggested that we might be dealing with an old grave where the vault had shifted or collapsed. He told me to fill it again and monitor the situation, maybe install a drainage pipe if water seemed to be the issue. I filled it a second time, this time adding extra soil and compacting it in layers. The work felt familiar in a way that bothered me, as if I had performed these exact motions many times before. While I worked, I found myself humming a tune I didn't recognize, something slow and lilting that seemed to match the rhythm of my shovel hitting dirt. When I realized I was doing it, I stopped abruptly, but the melody stayed in my head for the rest of the day. The third time Plot 47C sank, I decided to research its history. The cemetery office keeps burial records in a combination of computer files and original handwritten ledgers, some dating back to the cemetery's founding. What I discovered made me request copies of everything related to that specific plot. According to the records, 3 different people had been interred in Plot 47C between 1943 and 1967. The first was Maria Santos, age 34, buried in March 1943. The second was an infant listed only as Baby Santos, interred in July 1945. The third was Miguel Santos, age 61, buried in October 1967. But when I cross-referenced these names with the cemetery's master burial index, only Maria and Miguel appeared. There was no record of Baby Santos anywhere except in the original handwritten plot log. I mentioned this discrepancy to Jerry, who suggested that infant burials from that era were sometimes recorded differently, or that families might have moved remains to family plots elsewhere. He seemed unconcerned about the paperwork issues, more focused on the practical problem of soil that wouldn't stay put. We scheduled Plot 47C for deeper excavation to check for vault damage or drainage problems. But before we could arrange for the backhoe, I started having the dreams. Every night for a week, I dreamed about working in Section C, filling the same rectangular hole over and over while someone watched from behind the larger monuments. In the dreams, I could hear crying, not the wailing grief of funeral services, but the quiet, persistent sobbing of someone who had been crying for a very long time. I would wake up with dirt under my fingernails, even though I always shower after work, and with that unfamiliar lullaby playing in my head. The 4th, 5th, and 6th times I filled Plot 47C, other groundskeepers started commenting on my behavior. Dale mentioned that I spent an unusual amount of time in Section C and that he had heard me singing while I worked. Rosa from the office said she had seen me there during my lunch breaks, standing next to the plot even when it didn't need attention. I didn't remember these visits, but I couldn't deny that I felt drawn to that particular area of the cemetery. By the 8th refill, I had developed a routine around Plot 47C that felt as natural as breathing. I would arrive at the sunken grave with my truck loaded with exactly the right amount of soil, work steadily while humming melodies that seemed to come from somewhere other than my memory, and finish by standing quietly next to the filled plot for several minutes. During these moments of stillness, I felt a presence that was neither threatening nor comforting, just persistent, like someone waiting for something important to happen. The lullabies became more complex as weeks passed. I found myself humming harmonies, as if accompanied by voices I couldn't quite hear. The songs had Spanish words I didn't remember learning, verses about sleeping children and patient mothers, and promises that everything would be all right. When I tried to sing them at home, I could never remember the melodies correctly, but at Plot 47C, they flowed as naturally as conversation. On a Thursday morning in late August, after filling the plot for the 14th time, I made a decision that surprised me. Instead of leaving when the work was complete, I borrowed a hand auger from the equipment shed and began drilling test holes around the perimeter of Plot 47C. If there were drainage issues or structural problems causing the repeated settling, I wanted to understand them. The first hole, about 3 feet from the headstone, hit something solid at 18 inches down. Not concrete or metal, but something that felt like wood under the auger bit. I expanded the hole carefully with a hand shovel, working with the methodical precision I had developed from months of attention to this plot. What I uncovered made me sit back on my heels and stare. It was a small wooden box, maybe 18 inches long and 12 inches wide, wrapped in deteriorated cloth that might once have been white. The wood was dark with age but intact, and I could see the outline of simple metal hinges along one edge. I knew immediately what it was, even though it wasn't supposed to exist, according to the cemetery's official records. I lifted the box carefully and set it on the grass next to the hole. My hands shook as I brushed away decades of soil, revealing carved details that became clearer with each gentle stroke. The lid bore an inscription in Spanish, "Duerme mi angelito," followed by dates that matched the mysterious entry in the plot log. July 15th, 1945 to July 20th, 1945. 5 days of life, then 8 decades of waiting. The lullabies I had been humming suddenly made perfect sense. They weren't random melodies that had somehow lodged in my memory. They were songs a mother might sing to comfort a child who couldn't sleep, promises whispered in the dark when there was nothing else left to offer. I understood now why Plot 47C wouldn't stay filled, why the earth kept sinking in that perfect rectangular depression. Someone had been buried here without proper recognition, without official acknowledgement, and the ground itself was calling attention to that oversight. I held the small wooden box for several minutes, feeling its weight and thinking about the woman who had lost this child and the father who had eventually joined them both in this plot. The cemetery records might not reflect baby Santos's existence, but the earth remembered. The soil knew who belonged here and would keep sinking until the truth was acknowledged. That afternoon, I brought the wooden box to Jerry and explained what I had found. We contacted the cemetery's administrative office and arranged for proper documentation to be created, updating the burial records to reflect all 3 interments in Plot 47C. A small marker was ordered, something appropriate for an infant who had waited 80 years for recognition. I filled Plot 47C for the 15th and final time yesterday morning. The earth settled naturally, without the perfect edges and clean lines that had characterized all previous sinkings. I worked quietly, without humming, and when I finished, the plot looked like any other well-maintained gravesite. The sense of presence that had drawn me there for months was gone, replaced by the peaceful quiet that marks a job properly completed. But sometimes, when I work in Section C, I still hear fragments of those lullabies carried on the wind. Not the melodies I learned through months of unconscious singing, but different songs, older ones, drifting from other areas of the cemetery where the records might not tell the complete story. I listen carefully now when the earth tries to speak, because I've learned that some truths are buried too deep for paperwork to reach. Some visitors to the cemetery never really leave, even after their own names appear on headstones. My name is Dale Morrison, and I've been the evening groundskeeper at Maplewood Cemetery for 6 years. My shift runs from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., which means I'm responsible for the daily closing routine that includes checking for stragglers, securing the gates, and ensuring that the grounds are properly maintained before the night security takes over. It's quiet work that suits my temperament, and I've grown comfortable with the rhythms of grief that play out among these headstones day after day. The cemetery spans 43 acres of rolling hills and mature oak trees, established in 1928 when the city expanded beyond its original boundaries. My responsibilities include maintaining the pathways, managing visitor concerns, and gently reminding people when closing time approaches. Most visitors are understanding about the 5:30 p.m. closure, especially during winter months when darkness comes early. They gather their flowers, have their quiet moments, and make their way to the parking area without requiring supervision. I drive a small electric cart loaded with tools and supplies, following established routes that take me past each section of the cemetery during my shift. The older sections near the original entrance require more attention due to settling monuments and aging landscaping, while the newer areas toward the back are generally well maintained and straightforward. Section J, where the earliest burials are located, sits on a slight rise overlooking the main entrance, shaded by trees that were planted in the cemetery's first decade. It was in Section J that I first noticed her, about 3 months ago. An elderly woman in a navy wool coat, kneeling beside grave marker J-108, with a small bundle of white lilies in her hands. From a distance, she looked like any other visitor paying respects to someone they had loved and lost. But there was something about her stillness, the way she remained in exactly the same position for the entire time I could observe her, that caught my attention during my routine rounds. Cemetery etiquette requires that I give visitors space for their private moments, while also ensuring that everyone understands the closing schedule. As 5:30 approached, I drove my cart toward Section J to politely inform the woman that the gates would be locked soon. But when I reached the area where I had seen her, she was gone. The only evidence of her visit was a neat arrangement of white lilies placed against the small headstone, 7 stems bound with what looked like a piece of white ribbon. The grave belonged to Timothy James McKenna, born February 12, 1947, died August 15, 1952, 5 years old. The headstone was simple granite with a carved lamb, the kind of modest marker that working families could afford during that era. Someone had been maintaining it well. The stone was clean, free of moss or weather staining, and the grass around it was neatly trimmed. The lilies were perfectly fresh, as if they had been cut that morning. I made note of the time and location in my daily log, more out of habit than concern. Visitors sometimes left flowers and departed quickly, especially if they were emotionally overwhelmed or dealing with personal grief that made social interaction difficult. The woman in the navy coat had simply been more discreet than most, though I couldn't quite understand how she had left the area without my noticing. Section J is open ground with clear sight lines, and my cart had been positioned where I should have seen anyone walking toward the parking area. The next evening, she was there again. Same navy coat, same kneeling position beside Timothy McKenna's grave, same bundle of white lilies. This time I checked my watch and noted that she arrived at exactly 5:17 p.m., which gave me 13 minutes to complete my rounds before approaching her about closing time. I deliberately positioned my cart to maintain visual contact with Section J while I finished checking the other areas. But when I looked again at 5:28, she had vanished, just as completely as the day before. 7 fresh white lilies lay against Timothy's headstone, arranged with the same careful precision. I examined the flowers closely and found them to be of exceptional quality. No wilted petals, no brown edges, no signs of transport damage. They looked as if they had been picked moments earlier from a professional garden, though I knew of no flower shops in the area that specialized in such perfect specimens. I started timing her appearances more carefully after the 3rd consecutive evening. The woman in the navy coat arrived at Section J at precisely 5:17 p.m. and remained kneeling beside grave marker J-108 until I began my approach, at which point she disappeared without any visible means of departure. The timing never varied by more than a few seconds, and the flowers were always identical, 7 white lilies, perfectly fresh, bound with white ribbon. After a week of these punctual visits, I decided to research the grave's history. Cemetery records from the 1950s were kept in a combination of ledger books and index cards, stored in filing cabinets in the administrative office. What I discovered about Timothy McKenna and his family provided context that made the woman's visits more understandable, though no less mysterious. Timothy had died of polio during the epidemic that swept through the region in 1952. His parents were listed as James and Dorothy McKenna, and the burial records indicated that the family had purchased a double plot, with plans for James and Dorothy to eventually be interred alongside their son. But according to the cemetery's master index, only Timothy was buried in Section J. James McKenna had died in 1963 and was buried in Sacred Heart Cemetery across town. Dorothy McKenna was listed as having died in 1978, with burial location noted as unknown. I found additional information in a box of miscellaneous records that included correspondence and special requests from families. Among these papers was a letter dated 1976, written by Dorothy McKenna to the cemetery administration. In careful handwriting, she explained that she visited her son's grave every day and requested permission to place fresh flowers regularly, despite the cemetery's general policy against daily floral arrangements. The letter mentioned her advanced age and failing health, but expressed her intention to continue the visits as long as she was physically able. A notation on the letter, written in different handwriting, indicated that Mrs. McKenna had been given permanent permission for daily flower placement due to exceptional circumstances of prolonged grief and devotion. The note was dated July 1978, just 3 months before Dorothy McKenna's death certificate was filed with the county. Armed with this information, I began paying closer attention to the woman's appearances. Her navy coat looked vintage, with a style that suggested it had been purchased decades earlier. Her hair was white and arranged in the kind of careful waves that older women maintain through weekly beauty shop visits. She carried herself with the deliberate movements of someone managing arthritis or other age-related limitations, but her devotion to the ritual never wavered. On a Thursday evening in late October, I decided to attempt direct contact. Instead of waiting until closing time, I drove my car to Section J at 5:15 and positioned myself near enough to observe, but far enough to avoid seeming intrusive. At exactly 5:17, the woman appeared at Timothy McKenna's grave as if she had simply materialized from the evening shadows. This time, I could see her more clearly. She was probably in her 70s, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested personal pride despite difficult circumstances. Her navy coat was well maintained, but showed signs of long wear, with patches at the elbows and careful repairs along the seams. She moved with the slow precision of someone who had performed this exact ritual countless times, kneeling with obvious joint pain but unwavering determination. I approached quietly, not wanting to startle her, and spoke in the gentle tone I had learned to use with grieving families. "Excuse me, ma'am, but the cemetery closes at 5:30. You're welcome to stay a few more minutes if you need them." She didn't acknowledge my presence or give any indication that she had heard me speak. I moved closer, thinking that she might have hearing difficulties, and repeated my message slightly louder. Still no response. She continued arranging the white lilies with methodical care, adjusting each stem until the bouquet met whatever standard she maintained for these daily offerings. I stood directly beside her, close enough to see the details of her face and hands. Her skin had the translucent quality that comes with advanced age, and her fingers showed the swollen joints of arthritis. But her movements remained steady and purposeful. She was humming quietly, a tune I didn't recognize that sounded like a lullaby from an earlier era. When she finished arranging the flowers, she placed both hands on the headstone and began speaking in a voice so soft I had to strain to hear the words. "I brought your favorites again, Timothy. 7 white lilies, just like you always asked for when you were feeling poorly. Mama's here, sweetheart. Mama will always be here." The temperature around us dropped suddenly, as if a cloud had passed over the sun, though the evening sky remained clear. My breath became visible in small puffs, and I felt the kind of deep cold that settles into your bones during winter nights. The woman continued speaking to the headstone, her words becoming clearer as the air grew colder. "I know you've been waiting, baby boy. Mama couldn't find her way back for a while, but I'm here now. I'll keep bringing your flowers every day. just like I promised. Every day, until you don't need them anymore. I reached out to touch her shoulder, thinking she might be experiencing some kind of medical episode or confusion related to dementia. My hand passed through the navy coat, as if she were made of mist. The fabric looked solid, the woman appeared completely real, but there was nothing there for my fingers to contact. I jerked my hand back and stumbled backward, knocking over a small potted plant that someone had left at a nearby grave. The woman turned toward the sound, and for the first time, she looked directly at me. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, filled with a sadness so profound that it seemed to have weight of its own. She smiled gently, the way a mother might smile at a child who had discovered something important but difficult to understand. "He's been alone so long," she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of advanced age. "But I'm here now. I'll always be here." The cold intensified until my teeth began chattering, and the evening light took on a strange quality, as if filtered through old glass. The woman stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, and walked toward the oak tree at the edge of Section J. With each step, she became less substantial, fading like a photograph left too long in sunlight, until she disappeared entirely. I stood alone beside Timothy McKenna's grave, breathing hard in air that had returned to normal temperature. 7 perfect white lilies lay against the headstone, bound with white ribbon that looked exactly like what I had seen every evening for 3 months. The flowers were real, solid, fragrant with the sweet smell of fresh blooms. I still work the evening shift at Maplewood Cemetery, still make my rounds and remind visitors about closing time. Every evening at 5:17, I position my cart where I can observe Section J, and every evening, Dorothy McKenna arrives to place flowers on her son's grave. I no longer attempt to speak with her or explain the cemetery's closing hours. Some schedules are more important than administrative policies, and some promises transcend the usual boundaries between the living and the dead. The flowers are always perfect, always exactly 7 stems, always fresh enough to have been cut that morning. I've stopped questioning where they come from, or how a woman who died in 1978 can continue her daily visits. Timothy McKenna has been waiting for his mother for 45 years, and now she's found her way back to him. That seems more important than any explanation I might require. The dead have their own preferred routes, and sometimes they override the GPS to make sure you take them. My name is Jim Valdez, and I've been driving transport for Riverside Funeral Services for 9 years. My job involves moving the deceased from hospitals, nursing homes, and private residences to funeral facilities, and then from those facilities to their final resting places. It's steady work that requires discretion, punctuality, and respect for families during the most difficult moments of their lives. I drive a specialized vehicle equipped with a hydraulic lift system and climate control, designed to maintain dignity while ensuring safe transport. The routes I take are planned carefully, considering traffic patterns, road conditions, and the emotional needs of families who might be following in separate vehicles. I use a commercial GPS system that's updated monthly with current road information and optimized for larger vehicles like mine. After 9 years of covering the same service area, I know most routes by memory, but I still rely on the GPS for real-time traffic updates and to ensure I'm taking the most efficient path between locations. My typical day involves 3 to 4 transports, each requiring specific paperwork, coordination with receiving facilities, and careful handling of both the deceased and their personal effects. The work demands emotional resilience and professional composure, qualities that have served me well in situations ranging from routine hospital pickups to more challenging circumstances involving accidents or sudden deaths. I take pride in treating every person I transport with the same respect I would want for my own family members. About 4 months ago, I started noticing that my GPS was suggesting routes that didn't make logical sense. During transports from Riverside Funeral Services to various cemeteries throughout the county, the system would occasionally redirect me past Millbrook Cemetery, even when that facility wasn't our destination and the detour added 15 or 20 minutes to the journey. At first, I assumed these were glitches related to construction updates or temporary road closures that hadn't been properly removed from the system's database. The first time it happened, I was transporting Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell from Riverside to Sacred Heart Cemetery for a graveside service. The most direct route involves taking Highway 12 north for about 8 miles, then turning east on Cemetery Road. But as I approached the Highway 12 entrance, my GPS recalculated and directed me south toward Millbrook Cemetery, then in a wide loop that eventually brought me back to the correct destination. I followed the redirect, thinking there might be an accident or road work I wasn't aware of, but found no obstructions along the original route when I passed it later. During this unplanned detour past Millbrook Cemetery, I noticed something in my rearview mirror that made me adjust the angle for a better view. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been positioned with her hands folded across her chest according to standard practice, appeared to have moved slightly. Her right hand seemed to be pointing toward the cemetery gates as we drove past, though I knew that was impossible. The deceased don't move during transport. It's simply not something that happens, regardless of road conditions or vehicle vibrations. I mentioned the GPS issue to my supervisor, Dave Martinez, who suggested I update the system and check for any software conflicts. The update completed successfully, but the redirects continued. Over the following weeks, I was rerouted past Millbrook Cemetery during approximately half of my transports, always when carrying deceased passengers, never when driving empty or transporting families. The pattern was consistent enough that I started keeping notes in a small logbook I kept in the vehicle's glove compartment. The movements I observed during these detours were subtle, but unmistakable. A hand that had been flat against a chest would be angled differently when I checked the mirror. A head that had been centered would be turned slightly toward the window facing Millbrook Cemetery. These weren't dramatic shifts that could be explained by sudden stops or sharp turns. They were gentle adjustments that seemed purposeful, as if the passengers were trying to look at something outside the vehicle. During a transport in late October, I was carrying Mr. Robert Chen from Riverside to Sunset Memorial Gardens when the GPS directed me on the now familiar detour past Millbrook. This time, I pulled over in the small parking area across from the cemetery entrance and called Dave to report what I was experiencing. While I waited for him to answer, I checked on Mr. Chen through the partition window and found him positioned differently than when we had left Riverside 20 minutes earlier. His head was turned toward the cemetery, and his right arm had shifted so that his hand appeared to be pointing toward a specific section of the grounds, the older area near the back, where headstones from the 1940s and 50s stood in neat rows under mature oak trees. I had positioned him myself before departure, following the standard procedure I had performed hundreds of times, and I was certain about his original placement. Dave didn't answer his phone, so I documented the positioning with photographs using my personal cell phone, then repositioned Mr. Chen according to transport protocol. As I drove away from Millbrook Cemetery toward our actual destination, I watched the rearview mirror continuously. Mr. Chen remained in the position where I had placed him for the remainder of the journey, showing no further signs of movement. When I returned to Riverside that afternoon, I showed Dave the photographs and explained what had been happening during my recent transports. He listened with the patient expression of someone who had dealt with stressed employees before, then suggested I take a few days off to rest and consider whether the job might be affecting my perception of routine events. I assured him that I was handling the work fine, but accepted his offer to have another driver cover my routes for the rest of the week. Marcus Williams, who had been with Riverside for 12 years, took over my schedule and reported no unusual GPS behavior or passenger movement during his coverage period. When I returned to work the following Monday, the detours resumed immediately. During my first transport of the day, carrying Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman from Riverside to Pine Grove Cemetery, the GPS redirected me past Millbrook just as it had been doing for months. This time, what I observed was impossible to rationalize or dismiss. As we drove slowly past the cemetery's main entrance, I watched Mrs. Kellerman in the rearview mirror raise her right hand and point directly toward a specific grave marker in the oldest section of the grounds. The movement was deliberate and sustained, lasting for the entire time the cemetery remained visible through the vehicle's rear window. When we turned the corner and Millbrook disappeared from view, her hand returned to its original position across her chest. I pulled over immediately and called Dave, this time insisting that he meet me at the vehicle's location. While I waited, I researched Mrs. Kellerman's background using the information in her transport file. She had been born Dorothy Mills in 1928, had married Thomas Kellerman in 1949, and had lived in the same house for 63 years until her death from natural causes at age 94. The file included next of kin information and burial instructions, but nothing that would explain why she might have a connection to Millbrook Cemetery. When Dave arrived, I showed him Mrs. Kellerman's current position and explained what I had witnessed. He examined the transport area carefully, checking the securing straps and climate control systems for any mechanical issues that might cause movement. Everything was functioning normally, and Mrs. Kellerman remained motionless during his inspection. Dave suggested that road vibrations combined with stress and long hours might be creating optical illusions, but agreed to ride with me for the remainder of the transport to Pine Grove Cemetery. The return journey to Riverside followed the direct route without any GPS redirects, and Mrs. Kellerman showed no signs of movement while Dave was present. He documented the incident in my personnel file as a possible stress-related perception issue and recommended that I consider counseling services available through the company's Employee Assistance Program. I agreed to the counseling, but requested permission to research Millbrook Cemetery's records to determine if there might be logical explanations for the patterns I had been observing. My research revealed information that Dave's rational explanations couldn't address. Millbrook Cemetery's burial records, which dated back to 1935, included the names of family members and close relatives of nearly every person I had transported during the months when detours occurred. Mrs. Hartwell's parents were buried there. Mr. Chen's first wife had been interred in the section where he had pointed. Mrs. Kellerman's infant daughter, who had died in 1953, lay beneath the headstone toward which she had gestured. None of these connections were mentioned in the transport files or known to the families who had arranged services through Riverside. The relationships were distant enough previous spouses, deceased children, long-buried parents, that current relatives might not have been aware of the Millbrook connections. But somehow, during transport, each passenger had indicated awareness of these forgotten graves and had managed to direct both the GPS system and their own physical positioning toward people they had loved and lost decades earlier. I continued working for Riverside for 3 more months, accepting the detours as part of my routine and documenting the movements I observed in my logbook. The photographs I took became a private archive of moments when the dead seemed to assert their own preferences about routes and destinations, overriding technology and professional procedures to ensure they could acknowledge the graves of people who mattered to them. During my final transport for Riverside, I was carrying an elderly man named Frank Morrison from the funeral home to Oakwood Cemetery when the familiar detour past Millbrook occurred. As we approached the cemetery gates, Mr. Morrison's hand moved to point toward a grave marker in the newer section, where a headstone read, "Helen Morrison, beloved wife." I pulled over and sat quietly for several minutes, watching as he maintained that position until Millbrook was no longer visible. I don't work transport anymore. I found a job with a logistics company that moves freight rather than people, using routes that GPS systems follow without mysterious redirects. But sometimes, when I drive past Millbrook Cemetery on personal business, I slow down and look toward the sections where my former passengers pointed. There are always fresh flowers on those graves, placed by someone who remembers, and I wonder if love really does find a way to transcend the boundaries we think separate the living from the dead. Cold follows loneliness into the embalming room, and some chill never leaves once it settles in. Your bones. My name is Patricia Henley, and I've been a licensed embalmer at Westwood Memorial Services for 14 years. My work involves the careful restoration and preservation of the deceased, preparing them for final viewing and burial according to family wishes and professional standards. It's technical work, that requires steady hands, attention to detail, and the emotional resilience to treat each person with dignity, regardless of the circumstances surrounding their death. The preparation room where I work is located in the basement level of our facility, designed with proper ventilation, drainage, and climate control systems that maintain a consistent 68 degrees year-round. The temperature stability is crucial for both the preservation process and my own comfort during procedures that can take several hours to complete. I've always been sensitive to cold, so I particularly appreciate the reliable heating system that keeps the workspace comfortable even during winter months. My daily routine involves reviewing case files, consulting with families about specific requests, and performing the technical procedures that allow loved ones to say goodbye with dignity. Each person who comes to my preparation table brings their own story, sometimes peaceful deaths surrounded by family, sometimes sudden losses that leave relatives struggling with shock and grief. I've learned to read the subtle signs that tell me about a person's final days, the evidence written in their physical condition that speaks to how they lived and how they died. About 8 months ago, I started noticing irregularities in the room's temperature control during certain procedures. The first incident occurred while I was working on an elderly man named Harold Reeves, who had died alone in his apartment and hadn't been discovered for 3 days. As I began the arterial embalming process, the room's temperature dropped suddenly and dramatically, causing my breath to become visible in small white puffs that dissipated slowly in the suddenly frigid air. I checked the thermostat and found it still set to 68 degrees, but the digital readout showed 56 degrees and falling. The building's HVAC system was running normally, with no indication of malfunction or system failure. I called maintenance to report the issue, but by the time the technician arrived 20 minutes later, the temperature had returned to normal and remained stable for the rest of my shift. The maintenance report indicated that all systems were functioning properly, with no evidence of mechanical problems or temperature control issues. The technician suggested that a temporary power fluctuation might have caused a brief system reset, though there was no record of electrical problems in the building that day. I accepted this explanation and continued my work, though I made note of the incident in my daily log. The temperature drops began occurring with increasing frequency over the following weeks, always during procedures involving people who had died alone. I started keeping detailed records, noting the specific circumstances of each death along with the exact temperature readings and duration of each cold spell. The pattern was consistent enough that I could predict when it would happen based on the case files and personal information provided by families. Margaret Torres, 83 years old, found by a neighbor after missing her weekly grocery appointment. Temperature drop, exactly 12 degrees, lasting 47 minutes. Robert Kim, 67 years old, died of a heart attack in his home office while working late, discovered by his landlord 3 days later. Temperature drop, exactly 12 degrees, lasting 31 minutes. Sarah Williams, 49 years old, died alone in a hospital room during a night shift when visiting hours had ended. Temperature drop, exactly 12 degrees, lasting 55 minutes. During these episodes, I started noticing changes in the deceased that went beyond the expected effects of the embalming process. Their skin would develop the faintest flush of color, particularly in the cheeks and around the eyes, giving them an appearance of warmth that seemed to contradict the freezing air surrounding us. Their facial expressions would soften slightly, as if tension they had carried was finally being released. These changes were subtle but unmistakable, visible improvements that made my work easier and the final results more natural-looking. I mentioned these observations to my supervisor, Dr. Martinez, during our monthly case review meeting. He listened with professional interest as I described the temperature fluctuations and their correlation with solitary deaths, but suggested that the improved results I was seeing might be related to enhanced focus and attention during challenging cases. He recommended that I continue documenting the incidents while he consulted with the building's engineering contractor about possible HVAC improvements. The engineering review revealed no problems with the preparation room's climate control system. The temperature sensors were calibrated correctly, The ventilation was functioning within normal parameters, and there was no evidence of external factors that might cause sudden temperature drops. Dr. Martinez suggested that I might be experiencing a form of professional stress response, where difficult cases triggered physical reactions that made me more sensitive to normal temperature variations. But I knew what I was experiencing wasn't psychosomatic or stress-related. The cold was real, measurable, and specific to cases involving people who had died without companionship. During the temperature drops, my breath formed visible clouds that lingered in the air. Metal instruments became almost too cold to handle without gloves, and the normally comfortable workspace became an environment where I needed to wear multiple layers just to function effectively. More importantly, I began to understand that the cold was somehow connected to the loneliness these people had experienced during their final moments. It felt like a physical manifestation of isolation, a chill that had followed them from their empty apartments and hospital rooms into my preparation chamber. The 12-degree drop wasn't random, it was precise, consistent, as if something was trying to communicate the exact depth of the solitude these individuals had endured. I started responding to these episodes differently, treating them not as mechanical problems to be solved, but as communications to be acknowledged. When the temperature dropped, I would speak quietly to the person on my table, telling them they weren't alone anymore, that someone was there to care for them and ensure they were treated with respect and dignity. During these one-sided conversations, I noticed that the facial improvements became more pronounced, and the overall appearance of peace and comfort increased noticeably. The most significant incident occurred on a Tuesday in late November, while I was working on a woman named Eleanor Walsh. She was 78 years old, had lived alone for 23 years since her husband's death, and had been found in her kitchen by a postal worker who became concerned when mail accumulated for several days. As I began the preparation process, the familiar temperature drop occurred, but this time it was accompanied by something I had never experienced before. The cold was so intense that frost began forming on the metal surfaces of my instruments and equipment. My breath created clouds so thick they obscured my vision, forcing me to work slowly and carefully to avoid mistakes. But as the room grew colder, Eleanor's appearance began changing in ways that went beyond the usual improvements I had observed. Color returned to her skin not just in faint flushes, but in a warm, natural tone that made her look as if she were simply sleeping peacefully. I found myself speaking to her in the same gentle tone I would use with a living person, explaining each step of the process and assuring her that she was being cared for by someone who understood loneliness and recognized the value of every life, regardless of how it ended. As I spoke, the temperature in the room stabilized at exactly 56 degrees, and Eleanor's facial expression shifted into what could only be described as a smile, subtle but unmistakable, as if she were responding to the comfort of finally having company during a procedure that was preparing her for her final journey. The cold lasted for nearly 2 hours, the longest episode I had ever experienced. During that time, I completed the most thorough and careful preparation work of my career, taking extra time with details that would normally be considered adequate, but that somehow seemed insufficient for someone who had waited so long for this kind of attention. When I finished, Eleanor looked peaceful in a way that transcended the usual results of professional embalming. She looked loved, as if someone had finally acknowledged the person she had been, rather than simply processing the body she had left behind. As I cleaned and organized my workspace, the temperature gradually returned to normal, but the sense of connection remained. I understood that the cold would continue to visit my preparation room whenever I worked on someone who had died alone, and I accepted this as part of my responsibility rather than an inconvenience to be solved. These people deserved acknowledgement of what they had endured, and if that acknowledgement manifested as a 12-degree temperature drop, then I would dress warmly and continue my work. I still maintain detailed records of these episodes, not for Dr. Martinez or the engineering contractors, but for my own understanding of the patterns and needs they represent. The cold has become a signal that tells me when someone requires extra attention, extra care, and the comfort of knowing that their final moments on Earth are being handled by someone who recognizes their worth and honors their memory. When families ask why their loved one looks so peaceful and natural, despite the circumstances of their death, I tell them about the care and attention that goes into every preparation. I don't mention the cold that follows loneliness, or the way some people seem to respond to simple human acknowledgement, even after they can no longer speak. But I know that something important happens in that 12-degree drop, something that connects the living and the dead in recognition of our shared need for companionship, even at the very end. Headstones don't turn themselves, but sometimes the dead have their own ideas about proper arrangement. My name is Vincent Torres, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Elmwood Cemetery for 13 years. My responsibilities include maintaining the grounds, monitoring the structural integrity of monuments, and ensuring that the cemetery's layout remains orderly and respectful for visitors. I know the position of every headstone, the angle of every memorial, and the precise spacing that separates each gravesite from its neighbors. When something moves even slightly from its established position, I notice immediately. The cemetery spans 62 acres of gently rolling hills, with sections dating back to 1894 when the original plots were laid out in careful geometric patterns. The oldest area, known as Heritage Section, contains the graves of the city's founding families and early settlers, with marble and granite monuments that have weathered more than a century of seasons. These older headstones require regular maintenance and occasional adjustment due to ground settling, frost heave, and the natural movement that occurs as soil shifts beneath heavy stone foundations. My daily routine involves systematic inspection of all sections, noting any changes that require attention and prioritizing repairs based on safety concerns and family requests. I use a combination of hand tools and small machinery to maintain level surfaces, clean monuments, and make minor adjustments to headstones that have shifted due to natural causes. The work requires physical strength, attention to detail, and respect for the families who visit these graves to remember loved ones who have passed. About 5 months ago, I began noticing subtle changes in the alignment of several headstones in Heritage Section that couldn't be explained by normal ground movement or environmental factors. 7 monuments, dating from the early 1900s and arranged in what had originally been 2 parallel rows, seemed to be shifting their orientation slowly but consistently. Rather than facing the main pathway, as they had for decades, these headstones appeared to be turning inward toward a small, unmarked area of grass that lay between the established grave sites. The movement was so gradual that I initially attributed it to seasonal ground shifts or the cumulative effects of decades of freeze-thaw cycles. But when I consulted the detailed plot maps and photographs from previous years, I realized that the changes were more significant than normal settling would produce. Each of the 7 headstones had rotated several degrees from their original positions, creating an arc that seemed to be forming a deliberate pattern around the unmarked plot. I measured the distances and angles carefully, documenting the current positions with photographs and GPS coordinates. The 7 headstones belonged to different families: the Worthingtons, the Blackwoods, the Sterlings, the Porters, the Haydens, the Caldwells, and the Ashfords, all prominent families who had been buried between 1905 and 1928. There was no obvious connection between these families that would explain why their monuments might be oriented toward the same central point. The unmarked area at the center of their apparent focus measured approximately 8 feet by 4 feet, the size of a standard grave plot. But according to cemetery records, no burial had ever taken place in that location. The space had been designated as a maintenance area during the original layout, intended for equipment storage and groundskeeping supplies. Current maps showed it as undeveloped green space, with no plans for future use. Over the following weeks, I monitored the headstones closely and confirmed that the rotation was continuing. Each monument moved only fractionally from day to day, but the cumulative effect was creating a perfect circle with the unmarked plot at its center. The precision was remarkable. 7 heavy granite and marble monuments, each weighing several tons, were adjusting their positions with mathematical accuracy that seemed impossible without deliberate intervention. I reported my observations to the cemetery administrator, Mrs. Chen, who suggested that vandalism or ground instability might be causing the movements. We arranged for a structural engineer to assess the soil conditions and a security company to install motion-activated cameras near Heritage Section. The engineer found no evidence of ground instability or foundation problems, and the cameras recorded no human activity that could explain the ongoing alignment changes. But the cameras did capture something that made the situation more disturbing than simple monument movement. Each morning at approximately 5:15 a.m., the footage showed small objects appearing at the center of the circle formed by the rotating headstones. The items seemed to materialize during the few seconds between camera sweeps, with no visible person placing them there. Wedding rings, eyeglasses, family photographs, small jewelry boxes, and other personal effects would appear overnight, arranged in neat piles that suggested careful placement rather than random dropping. I began arriving at the cemetery before dawn to observe these manifestations firsthand. The items were always genuine personal effects, not costume, jewelry, or reproductions, but real gold wedding bands, prescription eyeglasses with specific lens strengths, and family photographs dating from the early 1900s. Many of the photographs showed people whose names matched the headstones that were slowly turning toward the center of the circle, suggesting that these were belongings that had been buried with the deceased or kept by surviving family members. The most disturbing aspect was the condition of these items. Despite appearing overnight on grass that was often wet with dew or frost, the objects remained perfectly dry and showed no signs of weather damage. A delicate lace handkerchief remained pristine after 3 days of rain. A wooden jewelry box showed no warping or discoloration despite exposure to moisture. Family photographs maintained their clarity and color as if they had been stored in climate-controlled conditions rather than left outdoors. I started collecting these items and storing them in a locked cabinet in the maintenance building, thinking that families might want to reclaim belongings that had somehow been displaced from grave sites. But when I researched the names and dates on the photographs and tried to contact descendants, I discovered that many of these families had no surviving relatives in the area. The items seemed to be accumulating from sources that no longer existed, placed by people who had been dead for decades. After 2 months of documenting the monument alignment and collecting the mysterious offerings, I decided to investigate the unmarked plot more thoroughly. I arranged for ground-penetrating radar equipment to scan the area, hoping to determine if there was something buried beneath the grass that might explain the supernatural activity. The results were both illuminating and deeply unsettling. The radar images showed a clear rectangular anomaly 6 feet below the surface, exactly the size and depth of a standard burial vault. Whatever was down there had the density and shape of a coffin or burial container, but according to every record I could find, no interment had ever taken place in that location. The cemetery's original plans, burial ledgers, and plot sales records all indicated that the space had been maintained as uncommitted ground since the cemetery's founding. I presented this information to Mrs. Chen, along with photographs of the aligned monuments and the growing collection of personal items. She arranged for a meeting with the cemetery's board of directors and the city's historical preservation committee to discuss the possibility of excavation. But before any official action could be taken, I experienced something that changed my understanding of what was happening in Heritage Section. On a Thursday morning in late October, I arrived at the cemetery before sunrise to find that the monument alignment had completed itself overnight. All 7 headstones now formed a perfect circle around the unmarked plot, their faces turned inward as if they were participants in some kind of eternal vigil. At the center of the circle, instead of the usual scattered personal items, I found a complete place setting for 7 people china plates, silver utensils, crystal glasses, and linen napkins arranged on what appeared to be an invisible table. As I stood looking at this impossible dinner party setup, the temperature around me dropped noticeably, and I began to hear sounds that seemed to come from beneath the ground. Muffled conversation, the clink of silverware against china, and quiet laughter drifted up from the unmarked grave as if a social gathering was taking place 6 feet below the surface. The voices were indistinct but clearly human, speaking in the formal cadences of an earlier era. I knelt and pressed my ear to the grass at the center of the circle. The sounds became clearer fragments of conversation about social events, business matters, and family news, all delivered in the measured tones of people who had time for lengthy discussion. One voice, clearer than the others, seemed to be thanking the listeners for joining them, expressing gratitude for their attendance at what sounded like a long-awaited reunion. The temperature continued to drop until my breath became visible, and frost began forming on the carefully arranged place settings. But rather than feeling threatened or afraid, I found the experience oddly comforting. Whatever was happening beneath that unmarked plot felt like completion rather than haunting, as if 7 families had finally been able to acknowledge someone who had been forgotten or overlooked during their original burial arrangements. I stood slowly and backed away from the circle, leaving the place settings undisturbed. The conversation continued for several more minutes, then faded gradually until only the normal sounds of early morning remained. When I returned later that day with Mrs. Chen and 2 board members, we found the area empty except for the 7 perfectly aligned headstones and a small pile of personal items that had been arranged with obvious care. We decided not to excavate the unmarked plot. Whatever was buried there had waited more than a century for acknowledgement, and the 7 families surrounding it had apparently taken responsibility for providing the recognition that official records had somehow omitted. The monument alignment remained permanent, creating a formal memorial to someone whose identity might never be known, but whose importance to these particular families was undeniable. I still maintain Heritage Section, still document the occasional appearance of personal items at the center of the circle, and still feel the presence of that underground gathering during quiet morning hours. The dead have their own ways of correcting oversights and honoring forgotten commitments, and sometimes the living just need to step back and let them complete their work. Some bells ring for the living, but others mark time for congregations that no longer need daylight to gather. My name is Alma Rodriguez, and I've been the night security guard at Riverside Cemetery for 7 years. My shift runs from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., during which I'm responsible for monitoring the grounds, checking all buildings for security breaches, and ensuring that the cemetery remains undisturbed during the hours when most people prefer not to think about death. It's solitary work that suits my temperament, and I've grown comfortable with the particular quiet that settles over the grounds after the gates close to visitors. The cemetery complex includes a small chapel built in 1923, designed in Gothic Revival style, with narrow stained glass windows and a modest bell tower that rises about 40 feet above the main structure. The chapel hosts funeral services during daytime hours and occasionally wedding ceremonies for couples who find meaning in starting their marriage in a place dedicated to remembrance. During my shift, the building should be completely dark and silent, secured with locks that I check during my regular patrol rounds. My nightly routine involves walking a prescribed route that takes me past every significant structure and through each section of the cemetery grounds. I carry a flashlight, 2-way radio, and a checklist of security points that must be verified and logged during each patrol. The work requires attention to detail and the ability to distinguish between normal nighttime soundswind through trees, settling buildings, small animals moving through underbrush, and indications of actual security concerns that would require further investigation or contact with local authorities. About 4 months ago, I began noticing that the chapel bell was chiming at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night. The sound was distinctive, 7 clear tones that echoed across the cemetery grounds with the resonant quality of a properly maintained bronze bell. At first, I assumed the chiming was connected to an automated system that had been programmed to mark certain hours, though 3:17 a.m. seemed like an unusual time for any kind of memorial observance. I checked with the cemetery administrator about the bell schedule and learned that the automated chiming system had been disconnected in 1998 due to complaints from nearby residents about early morning noise. According to maintenance records, the bell tower's electrical connections had been removed entirely, leaving only the original mechanical bell and its manual rope system, which was no longer in use. There should have been no way for the bell to chime without someone physically pulling the rope from inside the tower. During my next patrol, I made a point of being near the chapel at 3:17 a.m. to observe the chiming firsthand. The 7 tones rang out clearly, but when I immediately checked the tower access door, I found it securely locked with no evidence of entry. The manual rope system, visible through a small window, showed no signs of recent use. The rope hung motionless, and there was no indication that anyone had been inside the tower to ring the bell. I began timing my patrols to ensure I was positioned where I could observe the chapel during the 3:17 a.m. chiming. The sound occurred with absolute precision every night, never varying by more than a few seconds. But what made the situation more unsettling was what I observed on the 4th night of my focused attention to the chapel building. As the 7 chimes rang out across the cemetery, I noticed that the stained glass windows of the chapel were glowing softly from within, as if illuminated by dozens of candles or a gentle electric lighting system. The glow was warm and golden, visible through the intricate patterns of colored glass that depicted religious scenes and memorial symbols. But I knew that the chapel's electrical system was turned off at night, and there was no emergency lighting that would create this kind of illumination. The glow lasted for approximately 10 minutes after the bell finished chiming, then faded gradually until the chapel returned to complete darkness. During those 10 minutes, I could see the shadows of the window tracery projected onto the grass outside the building, creating patterns of light and dark that shifted subtly as if the light source inside was moving or flickering like real candlelight. I approached the chapel during one of these illumination episodes and found all doors securely locked with no signs of unauthorized entry. The windows were too high to see through directly, but I could confirm that the light was definitely coming from inside the building rather than being projected from an external source. When I circled the entire structure, I found no evidence of equipment or people that could explain the mysterious lighting. I reported these observations to my supervisor, Tom Martinez, who suggested that reflected light from nearby street lamps might be creating an optical illusion that made the windows appear illuminated. He recommended that I document the incidents with photographs and note any patterns that might help explain the phenomenon. I began carrying a digital camera during my patrols and captured several images of the glowing windows, though the photographs never quite conveyed the ethereal quality of the light I observed in person. The nightly pattern continued without variation for several weeks, bell chiming at exactly 3:17 a.m., followed by 10 minutes of soft illumination from within the chapel, then returned to darkness. I started to anticipate these episodes and found myself adjusting my patrol schedule to ensure I was positioned where I could observe the chapel during the supernatural display. There was something compelling about the regularity and beauty of the phenomenon that made it difficult to ignore or dismiss. But my careful observation routine was disrupted one night in late September when I made the mistake of looking directly up at the bell tower during the chiming. As the 7 tones rang out, I raised my eyes toward the source of the sound and saw something that fundamentally changed my understanding of what was happening at the chapel. The bell tower was not empty. Through the narrow openings designed to allow sound to carry, I could see a figure standing at the bell rope, pulling it with the measured rhythm required to produce the precise chimes I had been hearing for months. The figure was dressed in what appeared to be clerical robes and moved with the practiced motions of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. What made the sight impossible rather than simply unauthorized was the quality of the figure itself. It was translucent, visible but not solid, like a projection or reflection that had somehow gained the ability to interact with physical objects. I could see through the robed form to the interior walls of the bell tower, but I could also see the rope moving in response to the figure's deliberate pulls. I stood transfixed, watching this impossible bell ringer complete the 7 chimes with ceremonial precision. When the sound faded, the figure released the rope and turned toward the narrow opening where I stood looking up. For a moment, we regarded each other across the distance between the ground and the Tawera night security guard, and what could only be described as the ghost of someone who had once served this chapel in an official capacity. The figure raised one translucent hand in what might have been a greeting or blessing, then faded from view as the stained glass windows began their nightly glow. I remained motionless for several minutes, processing what I had witnessed and trying to reconcile it with any rational explanation. But there was no denying what I had seen, and no way to dismiss it as an optical illusion or trick of shadows. Over the following nights, I continued to observe the chapel during the 3:17 a.m. episodes, but I avoided looking directly at the bell tower. Instead, I focused on the illuminated windows and began to notice details that suggested the light inside was not random or mechanical. The patterns of brightness and shadow changed in ways that seemed to indicate movement within the chapel, as if people were walking between the light sources and creating shifting silhouettes against the stained glass. On several occasions, I thought I could hear faint sounds coming from within the building during the illumination period, not voices exactly, but the kind of soft rustling and subtle movements that accompany a gathering of people in a quiet space. The sounds were too faint to identify specifically, but they suggested activity that went beyond the simple lighting effects I could observe from outside. I began to understand that something was conducting regular services inside the chapel during those 10 minutes of supernatural illumination. Whether it was the spirit of a former minister maintaining his pastoral duties, or a congregation of the dead gathering for worship I couldn't attend, the chapel was serving its intended purpose during hours when the living world assumed it was empty and unused. The realization changed my relationship with the nightly phenomenon. Instead of viewing it as a security concern or unexplained anomaly, I began to see it as a continuation of the chapel's sacred function, adapted for congregants who no longer needed daylight hours or physical forms to participate in communal worship. The precision of the timing, the beauty of the illuminated windows, and the reverent quality of the bell chiming all suggested that death had not ended the spiritual life of this place, but had simply shifted it to hours when it wouldn't conflict with the needs of the living. I still work the night shift at Riverside Cemetery, still make my patrol rounds and check security points throughout the grounds. But I've learned to time my route so that I'm positioned at a respectful distance from the chapel during the 3:17 a.m. service. Some congregations gather on Sunday mornings, and others prefer the deep quiet of night when the boundary between sacred and secular becomes more permeable. The bell still chimes with perfect precision every night, and the stained glass windows still glow with their warm, mysterious light. I no longer think of these as supernatural intrusions into the normal order of things, but as evidence that some commitments transcend the usual limitations of mortality. And some churches never really close their doors to those who need a place to gather and remember what they once held sacred. Sometimes the paperwork arrives before the people do, and that's when you know death is running ahead of schedule. My name is Kevin Walsh, and I've been working as an assistant at Harmony Funeral Services for 9 years. My responsibilities include managing inventory, coordinating with suppliers, processing paperwork for funeral arrangements, and ensuring that we have the appropriate equipment and materials for each service we provide. It's detail-oriented work that requires careful attention to scheduling, budgets, and the specific needs of grieving families who depend on us during the most difficult moments of their lives. The funeral home operates with a combination of pre-planned services and immediate need arrangements. Pre-planned services involve families who make arrangements months or years in advance, often to spare their relatives the burden of making decisions during grief. Immediate need cases arise when someone dies unexpectedly, requiring quick coordination between our staff, suppliers, and other service providers. Both types of arrangements generate specific paperwork trails that I maintain in our filing system and computer database. My daily routine includes checking delivery schedules, verifying purchase orders, and confirming that incoming merchandise matches the documentation provided by our suppliers. Casket deliveries typically arrive with detailed paperwork specifying the model, size, finish, and interior options that have been ordered for specific services. I cross-reference each delivery against our scheduled services to ensure accuracy and proper billing. Any discrepancies are resolved immediately through contact with the supplier or review of the original purchase order. About 6 months ago, I started receiving casket deliveries that didn't match any services on our schedule. The deliveries would arrive with complete documentation purchase orders, delivery receipts, and specification sheets, but the order, numbers, and service details didn't correspond to any arrangements I could find in our system. The caskets themselves were high-quality merchandise that met our normal standards, but they were for funerals that didn't appear to exist. The first incident involved a mahogany casket with brass hardware and cream-colored silk interior, delivered on a Tuesday morning with paperwork indicating it was for a service scheduled for the following Friday. According to the documentation, the casket had been ordered 3 weeks earlier for someone named Margaret Thornfield, but I had no record of any arrangements for anyone by that name. I checked our computerized scheduling system, reviewed recent contracts, and consulted with my supervisor, but found no evidence that we had booked a service requiring that specific casket. I contacted the supplier to report the apparent delivery error, but they insisted that their records showed a legitimate purchase order from our facility, complete with my signature on the authorization form. When they faxed me a copy of the paperwork, I found my signature on a purchase order I didn't remember signing, dated 3 weeks earlier on a day when I had been working my normal shift. The handwriting looked authentic, but I had no memory of processing that particular order. On Thursday afternoon, an elderly woman named Margaret Thornfield collapsed at her granddaughter's wedding and died of a heart attack on the way to the hospital. Her family arrived at our facility that evening, requesting immediate arrangements for a Friday service, and they specifically wanted a mahogany casket with brass hardware and cream-colored interior. The casket that had been mysteriously delivered 2 days earlier was exactly what they needed, down to the specific model number and interior options they selected from our catalog. I processed the Thornfield arrangements normally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had anticipated their needs with impossible accuracy. The timing was perfect. The casket arrived just before it was needed, with specifications that matched the family's preferences exactly. But there was no logical explanation for how the order could have been placed 3 weeks before Margaret Thornfield's death, especially since she had shown no signs of illness and her death was completely unexpected. Over the following weeks, similar deliveries continued to arrive. Caskets would appear with complete documentation for services that weren't scheduled, followed within 24 to 48 hours by families who needed exactly those products. A steel casket with burgundy interior arrived on Monday for someone named Robert Chen, and Robert Chen's family contacted us Tuesday morning after his sudden death from a heart attack. A simple pine casket arrived Wednesday for someone named Dorothy Williams, and Dorothy Williams' daughter called Thursday to arrange a basic service that matched the delivered merchandise perfectly. I started keeping detailed records of these anomalous deliveries, noting the timing, specifications, and eventual use of each casket. The pattern was consistent deliveries arrived 1 to 3 days before the deaths occurred, with documentation that showed purchase orders dated weeks earlier. The families who eventually used these caskets had no prior relationship with our facility and no way of knowing what products would be available when they needed them. When I tried to trace the source of these orders, I discovered information that made the situation more disturbing than simple administrative confusion. The purchase orders all contained contact information for the supposedly deceased individuals' phone numbers and addresses that should have belonged to people who were still alive at the time the orders were placed. But when I called these numbers or attempted to verify the addresses, I found that most of them led to disconnected lines or locations that hadn't been residential addresses for decades. Margaret Thornfield's order listed a phone number that had been disconnected since 1995 and an address that had been demolished for a shopping center construction project in 2001. Robert Chen's paperwork showed an address for a building that had been torn down in 1988. Dorothy Williams' order included a phone number that belonged to a business that had closed in 1992. I presented this information to my supervisor, Janet Martinez, who suggested that there might be problems with our supplier's database, or that someone was using outdated information to place fraudulent orders. She arranged for a meeting with the casket company's regional representative to discuss the billing discrepancies and investigate the source of the unauthorized purchase orders. The supplier's representative, Mr. Harrison, arrived the following week with copies of all the questionable orders and assured us that their records showed legitimate transactions processed through normal channels. According to their documentation, each order had been placed by phone during regular business hours, with payment authorization provided through our established account. The orders were processed by different customer service representatives, but all of them reported normal conversations with someone who identified himself as Kevin Walsh and provided accurate account information. Mr. Harrison played recordings of several order placement calls that his company maintained for quality assurance purposes. I listened to someone with my voice speaking to the customer service representatives, providing correct account numbers and authorization codes while placing orders for specific caskets. The conversation sounded natural and professional, with no indication that anything unusual was taking place. But I had no memory of making any of those calls, and the orders were being placed for people who were still alive at the time of the recorded conversations. The most disturbing recording involved an order for a child-sized casket in white with pink interior, placed on a Monday morning for someone named Emma Rodriguez. On the recording, my voice provided detailed specifications and requested rush delivery for a service scheduled for the end of the week. But Emma Rodriguez was a healthy 7-year-old girl whose family I had never met, and she was very much alive when that order was supposedly placed. 3 days later, Emma Rodriguez was killed in a car accident while walking home from school. Her devastated parents contacted us that evening, and the casket that had been ordered in my voice was exactly what they chose for their daughter's service. The white casket with pink interior arrived at our facility the morning after the accident, accompanied by paperwork showing that it had been ordered before Emma's death, with delivery scheduled for the day her family would need it. I stopped listening to the recorded calls after that. Whatever was happening, it involved someone using my voice to arrange funerals for people who hadn't died yet, placing orders with an accuracy that suggested knowledge of future events. The administrative precision was perfect, the right products delivered at the right times for families who would need them within days. But the source of this information remained impossible to identify or explain. I began arriving at work early and staying late, hoping to intercept these mysterious orders or identify when they were being placed. I monitored our phone lines, reviewed all outgoing calls, and checked our computer system for any unauthorized access. But the orders continued to appear in our system with perfect documentation, always for people who would die within the next few days, always with specifications that matched what their families would eventually choose. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when I received a casket delivery for someone named Kevin Walsh. The paperwork indicated a mahogany casket with silver hardware and white interior, ordered 2 weeks earlier with my signature on the purchase authorization. According to the delivery receipt, Kevin Walsh had died the previous evening, and his service was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I stared at the documentation for several minutes, processing the implications of receiving funeral arrangements for myself. The casket was beautiful, exactly what I would have chosen if I had been planning my own service. The specifications matched my personal preferences with uncanny accuracy, as if someone who knew me very well had made the selections on my behalf. I called my doctor and scheduled a complete physical examination, thinking that I might have a medical condition I wasn't aware of that could explain why funeral arrangements were being made for me. The tests came back normal, showing no signs of illness or health problems that would suggest an imminent death. But the casket remained in our inventory, waiting for a service that had apparently been scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend in a state of anxious hypervigilance, avoiding activities that might be dangerous and remaining alert for any signs of health problems or external threats. Monday passed without incident, and I arrived at work Tuesday morning feeling relieved that the predicted service date had been inaccurate. But when I checked our schedule that morning, I found that Kevin Walsh's funeral had been rescheduled for the following Friday, with a note indicating that the family had requested additional time to make arrangements. I realized that the mysterious order system was adapting to changes, adjusting delivery schedules and service dates to accommodate circumstances that hadn't occurred yet. I no longer try to trace the source of the anomalous orders or question the impossible accuracy of the advance arrangements. The caskets continue to arrive with perfect documentation for services that will be needed within days, and families continue to choose exactly the products that have been delivered for them. I've accepted that someone, or something, is coordinating these deliveries with knowledge that extends beyond normal administrative capabilities. The mahogany casket with my name on it remains in our inventory, though the service date continues to be postponed indefinitely. I've learned to live with the knowledge that my funeral has been planned and paid for, waiting for a death that may come tomorrow or decades from now. Some arrangements are made by the living, and others are scheduled by forces that operate according to different timelines and different rules. Flowers have their own ideas about where they belong, and sometimes they travel at night to find the graves that need them most. My name is Sylvia Chen, and I've been working as a groundskeeper at Willowbrook Cemetery for 10 years. My responsibilities include maintaining the landscaping, monitoring the condition of monuments and markers, and ensuring that the grounds remain beautiful and respectful for the families who visit their loved ones. It's peaceful work that allows me to spend my days outdoors, tending to the gardens and pathways that make this place a fitting memorial for those who rest here. The cemetery covers 58 acres of gently rolling hills, divided into sections that correspond to different eras of the community's growth. The newest areas, closest to the main entrance, feature modern granite headstones and well-maintained family plots, where fresh flowers appear regularly from visiting relatives. The older sections, toward the back of the property, contain weathered marble monuments and simple markers from the 1930s through 1960s, many of which receive fewer visitors as family members have moved away or passed on themselves. My daily routine involves checking each section systematically, noting any maintenance needs, and ensuring that floral arrangements remain neat and appropriate. Fresh flowers are a common sight throughout the cemetery, placed by grieving families and friends who want to keep their loved ones' graves beautiful. These arrangements typically last several days before wilting, at which point I remove them and dispose of the old flowers according to cemetery policy. It's a cycle that repeats constantly. Fresh flowers arrive, fade, and are replaced by new tributes from people who continue to remember and honor the dead. About 8 months ago, I began noticing that floral arrangements were appearing in unexpected locations throughout the cemetery. Fresh bouquets and elaborate displays that I remembered seeing on recent graves would turn up overnight at older headstones in the more remote sections. At first, I assumed that families were redistributing flowers from their own plots to honor other deceased relatives buried elsewhere in the cemetery, though it seemed unusual for people to move expensive arrangements to graves they might not even know existed. The first incident I documented involved a large spray of white roses and lilies that had been placed on the grave of Margaret Thompson, who had been buried the previous week after a well-attended funeral service. The arrangement was beautiful and expensive, clearly a significant tribute from someone who had loved her deeply. But when I made my morning rounds 2 days later, I found the same arrangement carefully repositioned at the grave of Ruth Morrison, who had died in 1948 according to her weathered headstone. Ruth Morrison's grave was located in one of the oldest sections of the cemetery, where few people ventured unless they were specifically looking for a particular burial site. The headstone was simple granite with minimal decoration, and I had never seen fresh flowers there in my 10 years of working at Willowbrook. But the white roses and lilies had been arranged with obvious care, positioned perfectly to complement the modest memorial and creating a striking display that brought new life to the forgotten grave. I assumed that someone in Margaret Thompson's family had also been related to Ruth Morrison and had chosen to share the funeral flowers between both graves. It seemed like a thoughtful gesture that honored multiple family members while making good use of expensive floral arrangements. I made a note in my daily log, but didn't consider the incident particularly unusual. But over the following weeks, similar flower migrations continued to occur with increasing frequency. Elaborate arrangements from recent funeral services would disappear overnight from the newer sections of the cemetery and reappear at older graves that rarely receive visitors. The redistributed flowers were always placed with care and attention to aesthetic detail, as if someone with knowledge of floral design was deliberately creating beautiful displays for the long-forgotten dead. What made these incidents more puzzling was the apparent randomness of the selections. The flowers weren't being moved to graves that showed any obvious family connections to the recent deceased. Instead, they appeared at headstones scattered throughout the older sections, chosen according to criteria I couldn't understand. A bouquet of red carnations from a recent service would appear at the grave of someone who had died in 1952. Yellow roses from another funeral would turn up at a headstone from 1945. I started keeping more detailed records of these flower migrations, noting the original placement, the destination grave, and any patterns that might explain the redistribution. What I discovered was both fascinating and impossible to explain through normal family relationships or coincidental connections. The moved flowers seemed to match the personalities and preferences of the people buried in the older graves, as if someone with intimate knowledge of their lives was selecting appropriate arrangements to honor their memory. The red carnations appeared at the grave of Frank Muller, whose obituary from 1952 mentioned his love of gardening and his particular fondness for red flowers in his backyard garden. The yellow roses went to Elizabeth Harper, whose 1945 obituary described her as a cheerful woman who always wore bright colors and filled her home with fresh flowers. A spray of purple irises migrated to the grave of Dorothy Winters, whose obituary noted that purple had been her favorite color and that she had grown prize-winning irises in her garden for 30 years. The problem was that I had never read any of these obituaries. The cemetery's administrative office kept historical records, but I had no reason to research the personal details of people who had been buried decades before I started working at Willowbrook. Yet somehow, the flower arrangements were being redistributed according to information about preferences and personalities that I didn't possess and couldn't have used to guide the placement decisions. I mentioned these observations to Janet Martinez, the cemetery administrator, who suggested that some families might be researching their genealogy and discovering relatives buried in the older sections. According to her theory, people were moving flowers from recent funerals to honor newly discovered family members, using information they had learned about their ancestors' preferences and personalities. It seemed like a reasonable explanation for most of the incidents I had documented. But Janet's theory couldn't account for what I observed during a late afternoon in October, when I decided to stay after my normal hours to see if I could witness one of these flower migrations in progress. I positioned myself in the maintenance building where I could observe both the newer and older sections of the cemetery through the windows, hoping to identify who was responsible for the overnight redistributions. As dusk settled over the grounds, I noticed movement in the area where Margaret Thompson's grave was located. Through binoculars, I could see a figure kneeling beside the headstone, carefully lifting the fresh arrangement of yellow chrysanthemums that had been placed there earlier in the day. The figure appeared to be an elderly woman in a dark coat, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who was either very old or dealing with physical limitations. I watched as the woman carried the flowers toward the older section of the cemetery, walking along pathways that led to the most remote and seldom visited graves. She moved with obvious purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was going and had made this journey many times before. I lost sight of her as she passed behind a grove of oak trees, but I could track her general direction toward an area where several headstones from the 1940s were located. After waiting about 20 minutes, I walked quietly toward the older section to see where the flowers had been placed. I found the yellow chrysanthemums arranged beautifully at the grave of Helen Rodriguez, who had died in 1944 according to her headstone. The flowers had been positioned with obvious care, and a small note written in careful handwriting had been tucked among the stems. The note read, "For Helen, who loved yellow flowers and always brightened everyone's day." I researched Helen Rodriguez's obituary the next morning and discovered that it contained the exact sentiment expressed in the note. According to the 1944 newspaper article, Helen had been known throughout her neighborhood for the cheerful yellow flowers she grew in her front yard and for her ability to make people smile during difficult times. The note left with the chrysanthemums captured her personality perfectly, written by someone who seemed to have known her personally. But Helen Rodriguez had been dead for nearly 80 years, and the woman I had observed moving the flowers appeared to be elderly but not old enough to have known Helen during her lifetime. The handwriting on the note was steady and clear, suggesting someone with good, fine motor control rather than the shaky script often associated with very advanced age. The entire situation suggested knowledge and connections that crossed generational boundaries in ways that normal family relationships couldn't explain. I began staying late more frequently, hoping to observe additional flower migrations and identify the people responsible for these midnight redistributions. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I understood about the relationships between the living and the dead, and the ways that memory and love can transcend the normal boundaries of time and mortality. On a cold evening in November, I witnessed the most significant flower migration yet. Multiple figures moved through the cemetery after dark, each carrying arrangements from recent graves toward different destinations in the older sections. They worked with quiet efficiency, as if following a predetermined plan that allocated specific flowers to specific graves based on criteria that remained invisible to me. The figures appeared to be people of various ages: elderly women, middle-aged men, younger adults, but they all moved with the same purposeful determination and seemed to know exactly where each arrangement belonged. As they worked, I could hear fragments of conversation carried on the night air, gentle voices discussing the preferences and personalities of people who had been dead for decades, speaking about them as if they were still alive and present. One woman carried a bouquet of pink roses toward a headstone from 1947, saying softly, "These are perfect for Mary." She always said pink roses reminded her of her wedding day. Another figure placed white lilies at a grave from 1951, murmuring, "Robert loved the smell of lilies. They always made him think of his mother's garden." As I watched these impossible conversations and witnessed the careful placement of flowers according to intimate knowledge of the long dead, I realized that the cemetery had become a meeting place where different generations of the deceased were somehow able to communicate and care for each other. The recent dead were bringing flowers to honor the long-forgotten dead, guided by information that transcended normal temporal boundaries and suggested a community that continued to exist beyond the physical limitations of mortality. I stopped trying to document or explain the flower migrations after that night. Instead, I learned to work around them, arriving each morning to find beautiful arrangements at graves that had been forgotten by the living, but were apparently still remembered by other members of the community that exists in the spaces between life and death. The flowers continue to migrate according to their own logic, connecting recent grief with ancient loss in ways that suggest love and memory are more persistent than the physical world normally allows. When families ask me why their expensive funeral arrangements have disappeared from recent graves, I tell them that flowers sometimes spread throughout the cemetery to bring comfort to other families who need them. I don't mention the midnight redistributions or the conversations I've overheard between the dead. Some truths are too large for the living to carry, and some communities prefer to conduct their business in the quiet hours when the boundary between memory and reality becomes more permeable. Dead voices leave messages on machines that haven't been plugged in for years, and sometimes they're just trying to make an appointment. My name is Paul Hendricks, and I've been the cemetery administrator at Oakwood Memorial Gardens for 12 years. My office is located in the original administration building, constructed in 1947 when the cemetery was first established. The building houses our records, scheduling systems, and the archives that document every burial and plot sale since the cemetery's founding. It's quiet work that involves coordinating with funeral homes, maintaining accurate records, and helping families navigate the practical aspects of memorializing their loved ones. The office itself retains much of its original character, with hardwood floors, tall windows, and built-in filing cabinets that have held decades of cemetery documentation. My desk occupies the same position where previous administrators worked, surrounded by the accumulated paperwork and reference materials that make this place function efficiently. On a shelf behind my desk sits an old analog answering machine from the 1980s, a relic from before the cemetery upgraded to digital voicemail systems. The machine hasn't been connected to a phone line in over a decade, but I keep it for sentimental reasons, as a reminder of simpler times when technology was more mechanical and predictable. My daily responsibilities include processing burial permits, coordinating with funeral directors, maintaining plot maps, and ensuring that all cemetery operations comply with state regulations. The work requires attention to detail and familiarity with the complex record-keeping systems that track every aspect of cemetery operations. I spend most of my time reviewing documents, updating computer databases, and consulting with families who need assistance with burial arrangements or genealogical research. About 7 months ago, I started hearing the old answering machine activate occasionally during quiet periods in the office. The sound was distinctive, a mechanical click, followed by the whir of tape reels engaging, then the familiar beep that indicated a message was being recorded. At first, I assumed the activation was caused by electrical interference or vibrations from the building's heating system, affecting the machine's sensitive mechanical components. When I checked the tape after the first few activations, I found brief recordings of what sounded like phone conversations, though the audio quality was poor and the voices were difficult to understand. The recordings seemed to capture fragments of people discussing funeral arrangements, mentions of dates, times, and plot numbers spoken in the formal tones that families use when making difficult decisions about memorial services. I assumed the machine was somehow picking up stray radio signals or interference from nearby electronic equipment. But as the mysterious recordings continued to accumulate, I began to notice details that made me pay closer attention to their content. The voices on the tape were discussing plot numbers that didn't exist in our current cemetery layout. They mentioned section designations that weren't part of our mapping system and referenced arrangements for burial locations that had no corresponding sites in our records. The conversation sounded legitimate people, making real plans for real services, but they were discussing cemetery plots that simply didn't exist. I transcribed several of the clearer recordings and cross-referenced the plot numbers against our master database. None of the locations mentioned in the conversations appeared in our current records, though some of the section designations seemed familiar in a way I couldn't quite identify. The voices spoke about Section P, rows 15 through 22, and the area behind the old maintenance shed, but our cemetery had never used those particular designations, and there was no maintenance shed in the location they described. When I consulted our historical archives, I discovered information that made the mysterious recordings more disturbing than simple electronic malfunction. The plot numbers and section designations mentioned in the conversations matched locations that had existed in the cemetery's original layout from 1947 through 1963. During that period, Oakwood Memorial Gardens had included a potter's fieldan area designated for indigent burials and unclaimed remains that occupied the southeastern section of the grounds. In 1963, the cemetery had undergone major renovations and expansion. The Potter's Field was relocated to make room for new family plots and improved landscaping, with all documented remains moved to a consolidated memorial garden in a different part of the grounds. The old section designations were retired, and the area was redeveloped according to a new mapping system that remained in use today. But, according to the recordings on my answering machine, people were still trying to make arrangements for burial in sections that had been eliminated 60 years ago. I researched the names mentioned in the clearer recordings and found that they corresponded to people who had actually been buried in the original Potter's Field during the 1950s and early 60s. Margaret Winters, whose voice discussed arrangements for Section P, Row 18, had been interred there in 1957. Thomas Mueller, who mentioned the area near the back fence, had been buried in the Potter's Field in 1961. These were real people with documented burials, but they were trying to schedule services for cemetery locations that no longer existed. The implications of this discovery were unsettling enough that I consulted with Janet Rodriguez, the cemetery's records supervisor, to verify my research and get a second opinion on the historical documentation. She confirmed that the Potter's Field relocation had been completed in 1963, with all identified remains moved to appropriate memorial sites. But she also mentioned that some of the original burials had been poorly documented, and it was possible that not all remains had been successfully relocated during the renovation project. Janet suggested that the answering machine recordings might be caused by some kind of audio bleed-through from old telephone equipment or archived recordings that had somehow been preserved in the building's electrical systems. It seemed like a reasonable technical explanation for what I was experiencing, though it didn't account for the specific content of the conversations or their apparent connection to the cemetery's forgotten history. But Janet's theory became less convincing when I discovered that the answering machine was not just passively recording stray signals, it was actually participating in conversations. During one particularly clear recording, I heard a voice that sounded like my own responding to questions about plot availability and scheduling options. The voice provided accurate information about cemetery policies and pricing, spoke with professional knowledge about burial procedures, and offered appointment times that corresponded to my actual schedule. I had no memory of these conversations, and I was certain that I hadn't been using the disconnected answering machine to communicate with anyone. But the voice on the tape was unmistakably mine, discussing arrangements with people who wanted to be buried in cemetery sections that no longer existed. The conversations were professional and helpful, as if I were providing customer service to families who needed burial services for locations that had been eliminated decades before I started working at Oakwood Memorial Gardens. The most disturbing recording occurred on a Thursday evening when I was working late to process a backlog of burial permits. As I reviewed paperwork in the quiet office, I heard the answering machine activate and begin recording what sounded like a busy customer service center. Multiple voices discussed various burial arrangements, all referencing the old Potter's Field sections and requesting services for dates in the 1950s and 60s. I could hear my own voice among the conversations, apparently handling multiple calls simultaneously and providing detailed information about plot availability, pricing options, and scheduling for services that had taken place 60 years ago. The voice sounded exactly like me, but it spoke with knowledge of cemetery operations from decades before I was born, discussing policies and procedures that had been obsolete for years before I started working in the funeral industry. As I listened to these impossible conversations, the temperature in my office dropped noticeably, and the old fluorescent lights began flickering in patterns that seemed to correspond to the rhythm of the recorded voices. The analog tape reels turned slowly, capturing conversations that couldn't be happening, while frost began forming on the windows, despite the mild autumn weather outside. The voices on the tape became clearer and more numerous, creating a cacophony of overlapping requests for burial services in the relocated Potter's Field. I heard families discussing funeral arrangements for loved ones who had died decades ago, making plans for services that had already taken place, requesting accommodations for cemetery sections that existed only in archived maps and forgotten records. My own voice continued to participate in these conversations, providing helpful responses to every inquiry and scheduling appointments for burial services that had occurred before I was born. The voice spoke with my inflection and vocabulary, but it possessed knowledge of cemetery history and operational details that I had never learned. It discussed specific graves, family relationships, and memorial preferences with the expertise of someone who had been working at Oakwood Memorial Gardens since its founding. As the recorded conversations intensified, I began to understand that the answering machine was somehow connecting me to the cemetery's past, allowing families from the 1950s and 60s to complete burial arrangements that had been interrupted by the Potter's Field relocation. The displaced dead were still trying to contact the cemetery administration, seeking proper recognition and memorial services for burials that had been forgotten or inadequately documented during the renovation project. The voices spoke with the polite persistence of people who had been waiting for decades to finalize important business, asking questions about plot maintenance, requesting information about visiting hours, and expressing concern about the care their gravesites were receiving. They were the voices of families who had buried loved ones in the potter's field and wanted to ensure that those burials were still being honored and maintained according to proper cemetery standards. The frost on the windows thickened until my breath became visible in the suddenly frigid office air. The answering machine continued recording conversation after conversation, capturing requests from families who needed closure for burial arrangements that had been disrupted by administrative decisions made long before their deaths. My voice provided patient responses to every inquiry, scheduling appointments, and promising follow-up services that would somehow bridge the gap between past and present. When the recording session finally ended, the office temperature returned to normal, and the answering machine fell silent. I rewound the tape and listened to nearly 2 hours of conversations between myself and families from the cemetery's early years, discussing burial arrangements for people who had been moved from their original resting places but had never stopped trying to ensure their memorial needs were properly met. I still work in the same office, still maintain cemetery records and coordinate with funeral homes and grieving families. But now I understand that some administrative responsibilities extend beyond normal business hours and transcend the usual boundaries between past and present. The answering machine continues to activate occasionally, recording conversations with families who need cemetery services for locations that exist only in memory and archive documentation. I've learned to provide helpful responses to these impossible inquiries, understanding that good customer service sometimes involves accommodating clients who have been waiting decades for their calls to be returned. The potter's field may have been relocated, but the families who used it are still trying to ensure their loved ones receive proper care and recognition. Some conversations are worth having even when the callers have been dead for 60 years, and some appointments are important enough to transcend the normal limitations of time and technology. Some tools develop their own sense of where they're needed most, and sometimes the dead prefer to do their own maintenance work. My name is Maria Santos, and I've been the head groundskeeper at Riverside Cemetery for 15 years. My responsibilities include maintaining the landscaping, monitoring the condition of monuments and pathways, and ensuring that the grounds remain beautiful and dignified for the families who visit their loved ones. It's physical work that requires strength, skill, and an eye for detail. But it's also deeply satisfying to know that my efforts help create a peaceful environment where people can grieve and remember those they've lost. I work with a collection of professional tools that I've accumulated over my years in groundskeeping: sturdy shovels, precise pruning shears, heavy-duty rakes, and specialized equipment for monument maintenance and soil preparation. These tools are extensions of my hands, familiar implements that I know intimately and depend on for every aspect of my work. I keep them secured in a locked equipment shed on the cemetery grounds, organized according to my own system and maintained with the care that professional tools deserve. My daily routine begins at 6 a.m. when I unlock the equipment shed and select the tools I'll need for the day's work. I plan my tasks systematically, prioritizing areas that need immediate attention and scheduling longer-term maintenance projects according to weather conditions and seasonal requirements. The cemetery spans 47 acres of varied terrain, with sections that require different approaches and attention levels. Newer areas need regular mowing and basic upkeep, while older sections require more delicate work around weathered monuments and mature landscaping. About 9 months ago, I began noticing that my tools were occasionally missing from the equipment shed when I arrived for work in the morning. At first, I assumed that other cemetery staff members had borrowed equipment for emergency projects, or that I had simply misplaced items during busy periods. But when I found my missing shovel arranged neatly beside a grave that clearly needed attention, a grave I hadn't yet identified as requiring maintenance, I began to pay closer attention to these incidents. The grave where I found my shovel belonged to someone named Thomas Brennan, who had died in 1968 according to his headstone. The area around his marker had settled significantly, creating an uneven depression that needed to be filled and leveled. It was exactly the kind of maintenance issue I would have addressed during my regular inspections, but I hadn't yet made my rounds to that section of the cemetery. Someone had placed my shovel directly beside the problem area, as if marking it for my attention. When I examined the shovel, I found fresh dirt clinging to the blade, though I was certain I had cleaned all my tools before locking them away the previous evening. The dirt was the same clay-heavy soil that characterized Thomas Brennan's gravesite, and it was still damp, as if the shovel had been used recently for excavation work. But according to my schedule, no maintenance had been planned for that area, and no other cemetery staff had access to my equipment shed. Over the following weeks, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. My pruning shears would disappear overnight and reappear beside overgrown shrubs that needed trimming. My rake would be found positioned next to areas where fallen leaves had accumulated. My edging tools would appear along pathways that required border maintenance. In each case, the tools were placed beside specific problems that needed attention, as if someone with intimate knowledge of cemetery maintenance was conducting advanced inspections and marking priority areas for my work. What made these incidents more puzzling was the evidence that the tools had been used before being repositioned. My pruning shears often had fresh plant material caught in their blade, small twigs and leaf fragments that appeared to have been recently cut. But when I examined the vegetation near where the shears were found, I couldn't identify the source of these clippings. The plant material didn't match any of the shrubs, trees, or flowers in that area of the cemetery. I started keeping detailed records of these tool migrations, noting which implements went missing, where they reappeared, and what maintenance issues they indicated. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Tools disappeared from the locked shed during overnight hours and were found the next morning positioned beside graves or areas that required specific types of maintenance work. The accuracy was impressive. Whoever was moving my tools had expert knowledge of groundskeeping requirements and could identify problems that I might not notice for days or weeks. I mentioned these incidents to David Martinez, the cemetery administrator, who suggested that maintenance staff from other shifts might be borrowing equipment for emergency repairs. He arranged for me to meet with the night security guard and the weekend crew to discuss tool-sharing protocols and ensure that everyone understood the importance of returning borrowed equipment to its proper location. But when I spoke with these colleagues, none of them had any knowledge of the missing tools or the maintenance marking system that seemed to be operating without my authorization. The security guard, Jim Patterson, offered to review the overnight surveillance footage to see if he could identify who was accessing the equipment shed during off hours. We scheduled a meeting to examine the recorded material from several nights when my tools had gone missing. What we discovered in the footage was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. The security cameras showed the equipment shed remaining locked and undisturbed throughout the nights in question. No one approached the building, opened the doors, or removed any equipment during the recorded time periods. But the same cameras captured clear images of my tools appearing beside various graves during the early morning hours, positioned exactly where I would find them when I arrived for work. The tools seemed to materialize from nowhere, with no visible person placing them or moving them between locations. Jim and I reviewed the footage multiple times, examining it frame by frame to identify any explanation for the tool movements. The equipment would simply appear in the camera view, already positioned beside graves that needed attention, with no prior frame showing the placement process. It was as if the tools were teleporting directly from the locked shed to their overnight destinations, guided by an intelligence that understood both cemetery maintenance requirements and the specific capabilities of each implement. During one particularly clear sequence, we watched my shovel appear beside a grave where the ground had settled during recent rain. The tool was positioned at the exact angle and location where I would place it when beginning soil preparation work. A few frames later, the shovel appeared to move slightly, adjusting its position as if someone invisible were handling it. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable. The tool was being manipulated by hands we couldn't see. Jim suggested that we install additional cameras with infrared capability to capture activity that might not be visible in normal lighting conditions. We positioned the new equipment to monitor both the tool shed and several areas where my implements had frequently reappeared. The infrared footage revealed information that transformed my understanding of what was happening during the overnight hours when my tools went missing. The infrared cameras captured thermal signatures of people working throughout the cemetery during the late night and early morning hours. Dozens of heat signatures moved between graves, carrying out what appeared to be maintenance activities with tools that had somehow been removed from my locked shed. The figures were clearly human in shape and size, but they moved with the confident familiarity of people who knew exactly what work needed to be done and where to find the appropriate equipment. I watched invisible groundskeepers pruning overgrown shrubs around headstones, raking leaves from memorial pathways, and digging soil to level areas where graves had settled. They worked with obvious skill and care, treating each gravesite with the attention and respect that professional maintenance requires. The thermal signatures showed them returning tools to specific locations where I would find them the next morning, always beside problems that required immediate attention. The most remarkable footage captured multiple figures working together on a large maintenance project in the older section of the cemetery. They appeared to be restoring a family plot that had been neglected for decades, using my tools to clear overgrown vegetation, repair damaged borders, and restore the area to its original dignity. The work was complex and time-consuming, requiring coordination between multiple people with different specialties and tools. As I watched this impossible collaboration between invisible workers and my familiar equipment, I began to understand that the cemetery was being maintained by people who cared about its appearance and condition, but were no longer physically present during daylight hours. The thermal signatures suggested that the dead were somehow able to borrow my tools and continue the work of caring for their final resting place, ensuring that graves remained properly maintained, even when living staff couldn't provide adequate attention to every area. The realization was both humbling and unsettling. My professional pride in maintaining cemetery grounds was being supplemented by the ongoing efforts of people who had a more permanent investment in the appearance and condition of their burial sites. They understood the importance of proper maintenance and were willing to work during hours when they wouldn't interfere with my scheduled activities or disturb visiting families. I began leaving additional tools unlocked and accessible, understanding that my invisible colleagues needed equipment to complete their maintenance work. I would arrive each morning to find that significant projects had been completed. Overnight areas that would have taken me days to address were restored to perfect condition, with my tools cleaned and positioned beside new problems that required attention. The quality of the overnight work was exceptional, demonstrating knowledge of horticultural techniques and groundskeeping practices that matched or exceeded my own professional expertise. Shrubs were pruned with precision that promoted healthy growth. Soil was prepared and leveled according to best practices for long-term stability. Pathways were cleared and edged with attention to both function and aesthetic appeal. I started planning my daily work around the projects that were being completed overnight, focusing my efforts on areas that required daytime coordination with families or specialized equipment that couldn't be safely operated during dark hours. The invisible maintenance crew handled routine upkeep and restoration projects, allowing me to concentrate on more complex tasks and administrative responsibilities. The partnership worked seamlessly, with clear communication through the strategic placement of tools and the obvious priority given to different types of maintenance work. Problems that required immediate attention were marked with specific tools, while longer-term projects were indicated through the positioning of equipment near areas that needed gradual improvement over time. I still work as head groundskeeper at Riverside Cemetery, still maintain my daily schedule and professional responsibilities. But now I understand that cemetery maintenance is a collaborative effort that extends beyond the normal boundaries between the living and the dead. The people buried here continue to care about the appearance and condition of their final resting place, and they're willing to work alongside living staff to ensure that proper standards are maintained. My tools continue to disappear overnight and reappear beside graves that need attention, but I no longer consider these incidents mysterious or problematic. They represent a form of communication and cooperation that transcends the usual limitations of mortality, allowing people who can no longer speak to express their ongoing commitment to the place where they rest. Some work is too important to end with death, and some partnerships are valuable enough to continue, regardless of the physical limitations that normally separate different types of workers. Some rooms remember what they used to be, and they keep holding services even after the pews are gone. My name is Derek Walsh, and I've been working as a mortuary assistant at Henderson Funeral Services for 8 years. My responsibilities include preparing the facility for services, assisting with viewings and ceremonies, maintaining equipment, and handling the administrative tasks that keep our operations running smoothly. It's demanding work that requires both technical skills and emotional sensitivity, but I find meaning in helping families navigate the difficult process of saying goodbye to their loved ones. The funeral home occupies a historic building that was constructed in 1923 as a mortuary and chapel complex. Over the decades, the building has undergone several renovations to modernize the facilities and accommodate changing needs. The main level houses our current viewing rooms, administrative offices, and the primary chapel where most services are held. The basement level, which I access regularly for storage and equipment maintenance, was extensively renovated in 1987 to create space for filing systems, surplus furniture, and the mechanical equipment that supports the building's operations. My daily routine often takes me to the basement to retrieve supplies, check on the HVAC systems, or organize archived materials that accumulate over years of funeral service operations. The space is well lit and professionally organized, with clear pathways between storage areas and properly maintained environmental controls. During busy periods, I might spend several hours downstairs each day, moving equipment between storage areas and the upper floors where services take place. About 6 months ago, I began hearing what sounded like distant music coming from the basement during quiet periods when no services were scheduled upstairs. The sound was faint but unmistakable slow, reverent organ music of the type typically played during memorial services. At first, I assumed the sound was carrying down from the main chapel through the building's ventilation system, but when I checked the schedule, I found no services taking place that would account for the music. The basement's acoustics had always been somewhat unusual, with sounds carrying in unexpected ways through the maze of storage rooms and mechanical areas. But the organ music I was hearing had a quality that suggested it was being produced within the basement itself, rather than transmitted from another location. The sound seemed to emanate from the area near the building's original foundation, where the oldest structural elements remained visible despite the modern renovations. When I mentioned the mysterious music to my supervisor, Janet Martinez, she suggested that the building's sound system might be malfunctioning, or that radio signals could be interfering with our audio equipment. We scheduled a maintenance check of all electronic systems, but the technician found no problems with our equipment and no sources of unwanted audio transmission. The music continued to occur sporadically, always during periods when the building should have been silent. I started paying closer attention to these musical episodes and began to notice additional sounds accompanying the organ music. Faint voices that seemed to be delivering eulogies, the rustle of paper that suggested people turning pages in hymnals or programs, and the soft sounds of people shifting in their seats during a solemn ceremony. The audio created the unmistakable impression of a memorial service taking place somewhere in the basement, complete with all the human activities that such gatherings involve. During one particularly clear episode, I decided to trace the source of the sounds more systematically. Armed with a flashlight and a small recording device, I moved through the basement storage areas, listening carefully to determine where the phantom service seemed to be originating. The sounds led me to a section of the basement that had been converted to filing storage but retained architectural details that suggested a different original purpose. The area featured higher ceilings than the rest of the basement, with decorative molding and structural elements that seemed more elaborate than necessary for a simple storage space. When I consulted the building's original blueprints, which were kept in our administrative files, I discovered that this section had once housed a secondary chapel designed for smaller, more intimate services. The chapel had been eliminated during the 1987 renovations, converted to storage space when the funeral home's needs changed, and the upper-level chapel became sufficient for all services. But despite the physical transformation of the space, something about its sacred purpose seemed to persist. The phantom services I was hearing always occurred in this former chapel area, surrounded by filing cabinets and stored equipment that had replaced the pews, altar, and organ that once occupied the room. The acoustics still carried the sounds of memorial gatherings, as if the space retained a memory of its original function that transcended its current utilization. I began documenting these episodes more carefully, noting the timing, duration, and specific characteristics of each phantom service. The events typically lasted between 30 and 45 minutes, following the general structure of traditional funeral services with opening music, spoken eulogies, and closing hymns. The voices delivering eulogies spoke with the formal cadences and emotional restraint typical of memorial addresses, though I could never quite distinguish the specific words being spoken. During one evening when I was working late to prepare for a busy week of services, I experienced the most complete phantom memorial I had yet encountered. As I organized supplies in the basement storage area, the familiar organ music began, but this time it was accompanied by the full range of sounds associated with a well-attended funeral service. I could hear the voices of a substantial congregation singing hymns, the footsteps of people moving to and from their seats, and the quiet conversations that occur before and after formal ceremonies. The temperature in the basement dropped noticeably as the phantom service continued, and I found myself responding to the sounds with the same respectful attention I would give to an actual memorial gathering. Without consciously deciding to do so, I stopped my work activities and stood quietly in the storage area, listening to the invisible congregation honor someone whose identity I would never know. The experience felt like witnessing a sacred ritual that demanded acknowledgement and reverence, even though I couldn't see the participants or understand the specific purpose of their gathering. As the phantom service progressed, I began to hear individual voices more clearly, as if the speakers were becoming more present, or the acoustics were improving. A woman's voice delivered what sounded like a heartfelt eulogy about someone who had been a devoted parent and community member. A man spoke about memories of shared experiences and the lasting impact of a life well lived. Children's voices participated in responsive readings, creating the multi-generational sound of a family gathering to celebrate and mourn a beloved relative. The emotional weight of these invisible testimonials was overwhelming, even though I couldn't identify the specific person being memorialized or understand the relationships between the speakers. The love, grief, and gratitude expressed in their voices transcended the need for specific details, creating a universal experience of loss and remembrance that resonated deeply, regardless of the particular circumstances being commemorated. As the service reached its conclusion, I heard the congregation singing a closing hymn with voices that seemed to fill the entire basement space. The harmonies were rich and complex, suggesting trained singers or people who had sung together many times before. The music swelled to fill the converted chapel area, transforming the mundane storage space back into the sacred environment it had once been, if only for the duration of the phantom ceremony. When the hymn ended, the basement fell silent, with a finality that felt different from ordinary quiet. The temperature remained cold for several more minutes, and I continued to stand motionless until the atmospheric change indicated that the invisible service had truly concluded. Only then did I feel released from the compulsion to remain respectfully still, free to resume my practical activities in what had returned to being a basement storage area filled with filing cabinets and surplus equipment. I returned to the main level of the funeral home with a profound sense of having witnessed something that challenged my understanding of the relationship between physical spaces and spiritual purposes. The basement had briefly reclaimed its original identity as a place of worship and remembrance, hosting a congregation that existed only in memory but continue to gather for the essential human ritual of honoring the dead. I still work in the basement regularly, still retrieve supplies and maintain equipment in the storage areas that once housed a chapel. But now when I hear the phantom organ music beginning, I stop whatever I'm doing and listen respectfully until the invisible service concludes. Some spaces are too sacred to be permanently converted to mundane purposes, and some congregations are too devoted to stop gathering just because the building has been renovated around them. The phantom services continue to occur sporadically, always in the former chapel area, always with the full dignity and emotional depth of actual memorial gatherings. I've learned to recognize the signs that indicate when these invisible ceremonies are about to begin, and I plan my basement work accordingly, understanding that some activities are more important than supply organization or equipment maintenance. The dead deserve their memorial services, even when the living have converted their chapel into a storage room. Some phone calls come from people who don't realize they're 60 years too late to make their reservations. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and I've been a funeral director at Willowbrook Memorial Services for 14 years. My responsibilities include coordinating with families during their most difficult moments, arranging cemetery plot purchases, and ensuring that every detail of memorial services reflects the wishes of both the deceased and their surviving loved ones. It's demanding work that requires both professional expertise and deep emotional sensitivity, but I find purpose in helping people navigate the complex process of saying goodbye with dignity and grace. The funeral home operates from a building that has served the community since 1952, with updated facilities that combine modern amenities with the traditional atmosphere that families expect during times of grief. My office houses the administrative systems that coordinate between multiple cemeteries, florists, musicians, and service providers who contribute to memorial ceremonies. During business hours, I handle a constant stream of phone calls from families making arrangements, cemetery staff coordinating logistics, and vendors confirming delivery schedules for upcoming services. Most of my phone conversations follow predictable patterns: families discussing their preferences for caskets and flowers, cemetery administrators confirming plot availability and scheduling, suppliers verifying delivery times and service details. After 14 years in the funeral industry, I can anticipate the flow of these conversations and provide the information people need efficiently and compassionately. The work has given me familiarity with the practical aspects of death that allow me to guide families through decisions they've never had to make before. About 5 months ago, I began receiving phone calls from an elderly man who wanted to reserve a specific cemetery plot for his wife's burial. The caller identified himself as Harold Brennan and spoke with the formal courtesy of someone from an earlier generation, using phrases like, "If you would be so kind," and "I would be most grateful for your assistance." His voice carried the weight of age and grief, suggesting someone who was dealing with the imminent loss of a longtime companion. Mr. Brennan's request was very specific. He wanted to purchase plot number 47 in Section C at Willowbrook Cemetery, explaining that his wife had always admired the location because of its view of the old oak trees and its proximity to the memorial fountain. He spoke about the plot with intimate knowledge, describing details about the surrounding landscape and the peaceful atmosphere that would provide comfort to family members who came to visit. His familiarity with the location suggested that he had spent considerable time at the cemetery, perhaps visiting other family members or simply walking the grounds with his wife. When I checked our cemetery records, I discovered that plot number 47 in Section C had been sold and occupied in 1961. According to the documentation, it was the burial site of Elizabeth Brennan, who had died at age 68 after a long illness. The plot had been purchased by her husband, Harold Brennan, and the burial had taken place on October 15, 1961. The records were clear and complete, with all necessary permits and certificates properly filed. I explained to Mr. Brennan that the plot he was requesting was no longer available, but offered to help him find a similar location in the same section of the cemetery. He seemed confused by this information and insisted that he had been making arrangements for that specific plot, mentioning conversations with previous funeral directors and detailed plans that had been in development for months. He spoke as if the burial arrangements were current and urgent, describing his wife's declining health and their shared desire to finalize all memorial details while they still had time together. During our subsequent phone conversations, Mr. Brennan provided increasingly detailed information about the funeral service he was planning. He wanted white lilies and baby's breath for the floral arrangements, specifically mentioning that these had been his wife's favorite flowers since their wedding day. He requested that the service include hymns from their church's traditional repertoire, particularly How Great Thou Art and In the Garden, which he said held special meaning for both of them. He wanted the eulogy to mention Elizabeth's dedication to her family and her volunteer work with the church auxiliary. The details Mr. Brennan provided were remarkably specific and touched on aspects of funeral planning that required intimate knowledge of the deceased's preferences and personality. He spoke about Elizabeth's favorite dress, a blue one, with pearl buttons that she had worn to special occasions, and mentioned that she would want her wedding ring but not her other jewelry. He discussed family members who would be attending from out of town and requested that the service be scheduled to accommodate their travel arrangements. When I consulted our historical archives to research the 1961 burial records more thoroughly, I discovered documentation that made my conversations with Mr. Brennan deeply unsettling. The archived funeral service records for Elizabeth Brennan contained details that matched exactly what her husband was telling me over the phone. The floral arrangements had indeed been white lilies and baby's breath. The hymns performed during the service were How Great Thou Art and In the Garden. The eulogy had mentioned her dedication to family and volunteer work with the church auxiliary. Even more disturbing, the archived records included a detailed inventory of Elizabeth Brennan's burial attire, a blue dress with pearl buttons and her wedding ring, but no other jewelry. The service had been attended by family members from several states, and the scheduling had been coordinated to accommodate their travel needs. Every detail that Mr. Brennan was sharing with me during our phone conversations had been documented 60 years earlier during a funeral service that had already taken place. I began keeping detailed notes of our conversations, trying to understand how someone could have such precise knowledge of a funeral service from 1961. Mr. Brennan spoke about the arrangements with the urgency and emotional investment of someone planning a current event, not someone recalling something that had happened decades ago. His voice carried the stress and grief of a husband making difficult decisions about his wife's final arrangements, not the detached tone of someone discussing historical events. During one particularly long conversation, I decided to test Mr. Brennan's awareness of the current date by mentioning that we were planning arrangements for November of 2024. The moment I said the year, the line went dead with a sound I had never heard before on any phone call. It wasn't the normal click of someone hanging up or the electronic tone that indicates a disconnected call. Instead, the line filled with a low, rumbling sound that reminded me of earth settling, as if soil was shifting and compacting somewhere deep underground. I tried calling the number that had appeared on my caller ID during Mr. Brennan's previous calls, but found that it was disconnected and had been out of service for several years. When I researched the number through historical telephone directories, I discovered that it had belonged to Harold Brennan at an address that no longer existed, having been demolished for a shopping center construction project in 1973. The calls from Mr. Brennan continued to come regularly, always during business hours when I was available to take plot reservation requests. Each conversation followed the same pattern. He would ask about purchasing plot 47 in Section C for his wife Elizabeth, provide detailed information about the funeral service he was planning, and the call would end abruptly whenever I mentioned the current date or year. The sound that accompanied the disconnection became more pronounced with each call, creating an audio experience that made me reluctant to mention temporal information during our conversations. I consulted with Janet Rodriguez, our office manager, about the recurring calls and their unusual characteristics. She suggested that we might be dealing with an elderly man suffering from dementia or confusion about time, possibly calling from a care facility where outdated phone systems might explain the strange disconnection sounds. But Janet's theory couldn't account for the precise accuracy of the funeral details Mr. Brennan provided, or his intimate knowledge of cemetery, plot locations, and characteristics. When I researched Harold Brennan's own death records, I found that he had passed away in 1978, 17 years after his wife's burial. According to the documentation, he had been interred beside Elizabeth in plot number 47, section C, at Willowbrook Cemetery. The burial had been arranged by their son, who had moved to another state and had minimal contact with local funeral homes during the years preceding his father's death. The realization that I was receiving phone calls from someone who had been dead for over 40 years should have ended my participation in these conversations. But Mr. Brennan's calls continued to come regularly, and I found myself unable to refuse to take them. There was something about his voice, the genuine grief, the careful attention to his wife's preferences, the loving concern for every detail of her memorial service that compelled me to provide the customer service he was seeking, even though the service he wanted to arrange had taken place 60 years earlier. During our most recent conversation, Mr. Brennan's voice carried a note of increasing urgency. He explained that Elizabeth's condition was deteriorating rapidly and that they needed to finalize all funeral arrangements within the next few days. He asked specific questions about the timing of graveside services and the logistics of transporting family members from the funeral home to the cemetery. He wanted to ensure that every aspect of the memorial would reflect the dignity and love that Elizabeth deserved. As he spoke, I could hear sounds in the background that seemed to come from a different era, the distant chiming of a clock with mechanical bells, the faint music of a radio playing songs from the 1950s, and voices calling to each other with the formal politeness of an earlier generation. The audio quality of the call itself had an analog warmth that modern phone systems don't produce, as if the conversation was being transmitted through equipment that predated digital technology. When Mr. Brennan finished providing the details for Elizabeth's funeral arrangements, he thanked me for my patience and professional assistance. He mentioned that he had been calling several funeral homes, trying to find someone who could help him reserve the specific cemetery plot that Elizabeth wanted, and he expressed gratitude that I had been willing to listen to his requests and provide helpful information about the burial process. I found myself responding to his thanks with genuine appreciation for the opportunity to assist him, despite knowing that the arrangements he was making had been completed decades before I was born. There was something about his devotion to his wife and his careful attention to her memorial preferences that transcended the usual boundaries between past and present, creating a customer service situation that felt both impossible and entirely appropriate. As our conversation concluded, Mr. Brennan mentioned that he would call back once he had consulted with Elizabeth about the final details. Before I could respond or ask any questions about timing, the line went dead with the familiar sound of earth settling. This time, the sound continued for nearly a minute, creating an audio landscape of soil shifting and compacting, as if somewhere in the ground beneath Willowbrook Cemetery, preparations were being made for a burial that had already taken place but was somehow still being planned. I still take calls from Mr. Brennan when they come, still provide information about cemetery plots and funeral arrangements that were completed 60 years ago. The conversations have become part of my routine, scheduled consultations with a client who exists outside normal temporal boundaries, but continues to need professional assistance with memorial planning. Some customer service extends beyond the usual limitations of mortality, and some reservations are too important to be constrained by the dates when they were originally made. Dead people sign visitor logs with the same careful penmanship they used in life, and their handwriting never changes even after decades in the ground. My name is Janet Rodriguez, and I've been the office clerk at Hillcrest Cemetery for 12 years. My responsibilities include maintaining visitor records, processing burial permits, coordinating with funeral homes, and managing the administrative systems that keep cemetery operations running smoothly. It's quiet, methodical work that involves careful attention to documentation and a respect for the families who depend on our services during their most difficult times. The cemetery office sits near the main entrance, housed in a modest building that dates back to 1947 when Hillcrest was first established. My desk overlooks the visitor parking area and the main pathways that lead through the older sections of the grounds. During business hours, I interact with families researching genealogy, people purchasing burial plots, and visitors who need directions to specific grave sites. The work requires both professional competence and emotional sensitivity, as many people who contact our office are dealing with recent losses or long-standing grief. One of my routine duties involves maintaining the visitor registry, a bound logbook where people can sign their names when they come to pay respects to deceased family members or friends. The registry serves both as a security measure and as a record that families sometimes find comforting knowing that others have visited and remembered their loved ones. I replace the logbook monthly, archiving completed volumes in filing cabinets that contain decades of visitor signatures and comments. Most entries in the visitor registry are straightforward names, dates, and occasionally brief notes about the person being visited or remembered. Family members sign in when they bring flowers or tend to grave sites. Friends leave messages on anniversary dates or holidays. Local historical societies sometimes visit older sections to document genealogical information or maintain community heritage sites. The signatures reflect the normal patterns of cemetery visitation, with predictable increases around holidays and memorial occasions. About 8 months ago, I began noticing signatures in the visitor registry that seemed unusual in their style and content. These entries were written in formal, old-fashioned handwriting, with the careful penmanship that was taught in schools during the early to mid-20th century. The signatures stood out among the casual, hurried scrawls that characterize most contemporary writing, displaying the kind of deliberate letter formation that suggests careful education and practice skill. What made these particular signatures more intriguing was their apparent age compared to the dates they bore. The handwriting looked like it belonged to an earlier era, but the entries were dated with recent visits last week, yesterday, 3 days ago. The contrast between the vintage penmanship and the current dates created an anachronistic quality that made me examine these entries more carefully. The names associated with the formal handwriting were unfamiliar to me, but they had the ring of local families from earlier generation surnames like Whitman, Carmichael, Thornfield, and Brennan. These weren't names I recognized from current cemetery business or recent burial arrangements, but they seemed to belong to the community's historical family lines. The signatures were accompanied by dates of visitation that indicated recent activity, suggesting that these people were current visitors, despite their distinctly old-fashioned writing style. Curious about the identity of these visitors, I began cross-referencing the names with our burial records to see if they corresponded to family members of people interred at Hillcrest. What I discovered was both fascinating and impossible to explain through normal family relationships or coincidental name similarities. The signatures in the visitor registry matched exactly the names on headstones in the oldest section of the cemetery people who had been buried during the 1940s and 1950s. Margaret Whitman had signed the visitor registry 3 times in the past month, but according to our records, Margaret Whitman had died in 1948 and was buried in Section A, Plot 15. Harold Carmichael had signed in twice during the previous week, but Harold Carmichael's headstone indicated that he had died in 1952. Dorothy Thornfield's signature appeared regularly in recent logbooks, but Dorothy Thornfield had been interred at Hillcrest in 1946. When I compared the visitor registry signatures with the original burial documentation from our archives, I found that the handwriting was identical. Margaret Whitman's signature in last week's visitor log matched exactly the signature on her burial permit from 1948. Harold Carmichael's careful script was the same in both the recent registry entry and his 1952 funeral arrangements. The consistency was remarkable, just similar handwriting, but identical letter formation, pen pressure, and individual characteristics that make each person's signature unique. I started keeping copies of the unusual signatures and comparing them systematically with archive documents. The matches were perfect in every case, displaying not only the same general handwriting style, but the specific quirks and details that forensic analysts use to verify signature authenticity. The dot placement on I's the loop formation in G's and Y's, the pressure variations that create subtle line thickness change every characteristic matched between signatures written decades apart. The implications of this discovery were unsettling enough that I consulted with David Martinez, the cemetery administrator, about the unusual visitor registry entries. I showed him copies of the recent signatures alongside photocopies of the original burial documents, pointing out the identical handwriting characteristics. David examined the evidence carefully, noting the remarkable similarity between old and new signatures. David suggested that the matching signatures might belong to relatives who shared similar handwriting characteristics with their deceased family members' children or grandchildren who had learned penmanship from parents or grandparents and retained those writing styles into adulthood. It seemed like a reasonable explanation for most of the coincidences, though it didn't account for the precise identical nature of the signature matches or the fact that many of the original signers had died without known surviving relatives. But David's theory became less convincing when I discovered additional information about the people whose signatures were appearing in recent visitor logs. When I researched the family histories of Margaret Whitman, Harold Carmichael, Dorothy Thornfield, and the others, I found that most of them had died without children or had outlived their descendants. There were no surviving family members who could have inherited their handwriting characteristics or learned their signature patterns. Margaret Whitman had been unmarried and childless when she died in 1948. Harold Carmichael's only son had been killed in the Korean War 2 years after his father's death. Dorothy Thornfield had outlived her husband and children, dying alone in a nursing home in 1946. The people whose signatures were appearing in our visitor registry had no living relatives who could explain the handwriting matches through family inheritance or learned behavior. I began arriving at the office early and staying late, hoping to observe these mysterious visitors and understand how they were gaining access to the registry during hours when the office should be secure. The visitor logbook was kept on a table near the main entrance, accessible to people during regular visiting hours, but supposedly secure when the office was locked and the cemetery gates were closed to public access. During one evening when I remained in the office after normal hours, I experienced something that fundamentally changed my understanding of who was signing our visitor registry. As dusk settled over the cemetery grounds, I heard the soft sound of footsteps on the gravel pathways outside my office window. Through the glass, I could see figures walking slowly among the headstones, moving with the careful deliberation of people who were familiar with the terrain and comfortable navigating in limited light. The figures appeared to be elderly, dressed in clothing that seemed formal and somewhat outdated long coats, proper hats, and shoes that reflected an earlier era's standards of public appearance. They moved individually rather than in groups, each person following their own path through the cemetery sections toward destinations that seemed predetermined and specific. As I watched through the office window, several of these figures approached the building and entered through the front door, which I was certain I had locked when regular visiting hours ended. They moved quietly to the visitor registry table, signed their names with deliberate care, and departed as silently as they had arrived. The entire process took only a few minutes for each visitor, but I could see them clearly through the glass that separated my office from the main reception area. What made the experience impossible rather than simply unusual was the transparency of the figures. They were clearly visible and moved with solid purposefulness, but I could see through them to the furniture and walls behind them. They cast no shadows, despite the artificial lighting in the reception area, and their footsteps made no sound on the hard flooring that normally announced every visitor's arrival and departure. I remained motionless at my desk, watching as people who had been dead for decades signed the visitor registry with the same careful penmanship they had used in life. Each signature was written with obvious care and attention to proper form, reflecting the educational standards and personal pride of an earlier generation. They signed their names as if they were ordinary visitors, paying ordinary respects, following the same social protocols they had observed during their lifetimes. After the translucent visitors completed their registry entries and departed, I approached the logbook to see what they had written. The signatures were there in fresh ink, identical to the historical documents in our archives but dated with today's information. Margaret Whitman had signed in at 7:30 p.m. Harold Carmichael's entry was timed at 7:45 p.m. Dorothy Thornfield had signed at 8:10 p.m., adding a brief note, visiting old friends and making sure everything looks proper. The ink was wet and real, the handwriting was perfect, and the dates were current. But the people who had written these entries had been dead for over 70 years, somehow returning to sign themselves in as visitors to their own cemetery. The registry now contained documentation of visits from people who existed only as names on headstones and memories in archived records. I checked the door and found it securely locked, with no evidence of unauthorized entry or security breaches. The visitor registry was the only indication that anyone had been in the building during the evening hours, but the signatures provided clear documentation that people had accessed the building and completed their business according to established procedures. Over the following weeks, I continued to document these supernatural visitor registry entries, noting the timing, handwriting characteristics, and any additional comments left by the deceased signers. The signatures appeared regularly, always during evening hours when the cemetery was officially closed, always written with the same careful penmanship that characterized each person's historical documents. Some of the signatures were accompanied by brief notes that provided insight into why these people were returning to visit their own cemetery. They wrote about checking on family graves, ensuring that memorial sites were properly maintained, and visiting with old friends who were buried in nearby plots. Their comments reflected ongoing concern for the cemetery's appearance and continued connection to the community they had been part of during their lifetimes. I stopped researching the names and trying to understand the historical connections between the signatures and burial records. The evidence was clear, and the implications were beyond my ability to explain through normal administrative procedures or rational analysis. Dead people were signing our visitor registry, and they were doing so with the same social courtesy and attention to proper behavior that they had demonstrated during their lives. I still maintained the visitor registry, still archive completed logbooks, and still process the routine administrative tasks that keep cemetery operations functioning smoothly. But now I understand that our visitor records document more than just the living people who come to pay respects to deceased family members and friends. The registry also serves people who have a more permanent connection to the cemetery, who continue to visit and care about the community they joined when they were buried here. The signatures continue to appear regularly, always in perfect handwriting that matches archived documents from decades past. I've learned to expect these entries and to treat them as part of the normal administrative routine, understanding that good record-keeping sometimes involves documenting visits from people who exist outside the usual boundaries between life and death. Some visitors never really leave, and some signatures are too important to question or remove from our permanent records.